Good evening, and welcome back to History by Lamplight. There is a moment, just before sleep, when the edges of the world go soft. The sharp lines of the room blur a little. The sounds of the day begin to pull back from wherever you are, and in the space they leave behind, something quieter moves in. That specific feeling, that slow loosening at the border between waking and dreaming, is something human beings have known for as long as there have been human beings. And for a long time, in the cold, northern reaches of the world, people who lived close to ice and sea and long winter darkness had stories for what waited on the other side of that border. Tonight we are going somewhere most bedtime stories do not. Not to a happy ending, not to a world that resolves itself cleanly and leaves you with a tidy lesson, to something rarer. A mythology that looked at catastrophe clearly, that named the end of everything Ragnarok, and that chose, in full knowledge of what was coming, to light fires anyway. What survives of these stories comes to us through medieval Icelandic texts, shaped by memory, poetry, and centuries of retelling before anyone wrote them down. The two most important of those texts are known as the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, and we will talk about them properly near the end of tonight's journey. For now, it is enough to know that what you are about to hear has passed through many hands and many winters before it reached you. Something older still breathes underneath the words. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders settle. Let the room go quiet around you. This is a long story. It begins, as all things do in Norse cosmology, with nothing. Before the Norse world had gods, it had silence, and the silence was violent. Most creation stories begin with something. A god who speaks light into existence. A divine hand shaping clay. A cosmic egg cracking open to reveal the world inside. The Norse story begins with none of that. It begins with a gap. The old texts call it Ginnungagap. The word does not translate cleanly into English. Scholars of Old Norse have described it as the yawning void, or the gaping abyss. But neither phrase fully carries what the surviving texts seem to mean. It was not simply empty space waiting to be filled. It was more like a held breath, a stillness that had weight to it, a charged kind of silence that felt, in the way the texts describe it, as though it already contained the pressure of everything that was going to happen inside it. Not a beginning. Not yet. Just the condition that made a beginning possible. And on either side of this void, two worlds existed that could not have been more different from each other. To the south lay Muspelheim. The surviving sources describe it as a realm of fire and heat, so ancient and so extreme that it had no origin anyone could point to. It had simply always been burning. Sparks drifted from it constantly, floating out into the void in long, slow arcs. Embers travelled distances that had no name because distance itself had not yet been defined. Muspelheim was not a place you could enter and survive. It was barely a place at all in any sense that a living mind could organise. It was brightness and heat, and the oldest burning there has ever been. Existing before the first god, before the first thought, before anything that could notice it and give it a name. Its guardian, according to some of the sources, was a being named Surt. He is described as carrying a flaming sword, and the texts tell us that at the very end of the world, at Ragnarok, it will be Surt who sets the earth ablaze and burns what remains. He is there at the beginning, and he is there at the ending. A figure made entirely of fire, waiting at the edge of existence with a patience that has no limit because he has never needed one. To the north lay Niflheim, where Muspelheim was all heat and light. Niflheim was cold and dark and still. Not peaceful still, not the stillness of rest, the stillness of something that has never moved and does not know how. At the heart of Niflheim ran a spring called Hvergelmir. It is described in the surviving texts as a source of rivers, the original water from which so much else in the world eventually came. From Hvergelmir flowed 11 rivers collectively known as the Elivagar, a name that carries something like the meaning of stormy waves or ice, cold waters in Old Norse. These rivers carried with them something the texts describe in terms that resist easy modern translation. a substance that was not quite water and not quite ice, but something between them, something that moved slowly and hardened as it travelled away from its source, spreading out across the floor of the void in great frozen layers that built up over a span of time that had no measurement, for what the texts imply was an immeasurable period. These two things simply existed: fire to the south, ice to the north, the void between them. There was no one to observe this. There was no light to see by. There was no clock to mark how long it lasted. There was just the burning on one side and the freezing on the other, and the absolute silence of the gap between them. A silence so deep and so old that it had texture to it, weight to it, a quality of waiting that was not patience, because patience requires someone to be patient. Then the warmth drifting outward from Muspelheim reached the frozen layers that had spread from Niflheim, and something happened that was neither fire nor ice. Where the heat touched the frost began to melt, not all at once, slowly, in the way that ice always melts at its edges when warmth finds it, one thin layer at a time, water appearing where there had only been solid cold, and from that melt, from that meeting of the two oldest forces in existence, something formed that had never existed before. His name was Ymir. The surviving sources are not perfectly consistent with each other about exactly how Ymir came into being, and scholars who study these texts note carefully that the various accounts do not always align. What the sources agree on is the essential fact: Ymir was the first being, a figure of immense scale, and he was not made by anyone. He was not intended. He was not the fulfillment of some divine plan or the result of any deliberate act. He appeared the way that reactions appear when the right conditions meet, without design, without purpose, without anyone standing over the process and guiding it toward a particular outcome. He simply was, suddenly, in a void that had contained nothing a moment before. This is worth pausing on, because it shapes everything that comes after. Many of the world's creation stories begin with intention. A god exists, fully formed, and decides to make something. The decision comes first, and creation follows from it. Order is the starting point, and everything else is built on top of that order. The Norse story moves in a completely different direction. The first thing to exist is not a god. It is not a plan. It is a being who was never meant to be, produced by a collision that no one arranged, in a void that had no interest in what happened inside it. There is no intention at the origin of the Norse universe. There is only reaction. Ymir slept, and as he slept, he sweat, and from his sweat, the texts tell us, other beings formed. From beneath his left arm, a male and a female appeared. From his legs, Aesir, these were the first of the frost giants, the beings the Norse called the Jotnar, and they would remain a constant and defining presence in Norse mythology from this first moment all the way to its final hour. They were not evil in the way that word functions in later traditions. They were not demons or fallen beings or corruption made flesh. They were simply the first children of the first being, formed from his body without his knowledge while he slept in the void, alongside Ymir. Something else emerged from the melting ice of that first meeting between fire and cold. Akov. Her name was Audhumla, and she was enormous, as everything in these early moments is enormous, because scale had not yet been invented, and everything was still operating at the size of a void. From her body flowed 4 rivers of milk, and these rivers fed Ymir, she herself fed by licking at the great blocks of salty ice that surrounded her, finding nourishment in the frozen substance of Niflheim, the way a living thing finds what it needs when there is nothing else available. On the first day that Audhumla licked the ice, something appeared in the block she was working at. Hair. On the second day, a head emerged from the ice. On the third day, a complete figure stood where there had only been frozen salt. His name was Buri. He was not a giant. He was something different, something the texts describe as fair and large and powerful, the first of a different kind of being. Buri had a son named Bor, and Bor, in time, had 3 sons of his own. Their names were Odin, Vili, and We. These three brothers looked at the world they had been born into, a void that was no longer quite empty, but not yet anything you could call a world, dominated by the enormous presence of Ymir and the growing population of frost giants that continued to emerge from him. And they made a decision. They killed him. There is no extended deliberation in the sources about this moment. There is no divine tribunal convened to weigh what is about to happen. No warning is sent to Ymir. No negotiation is attempted. The three brothers simply acted. Odin, Vili, and they killed the first being, the original figure who had appeared in the void before any of them existed. And from that act of killing, the world as it would come to be known was born. The blood that poured from Ymir's wounds was so immense in volume that it drowned nearly all of the frost giants who had descended from him. Only two survived, a pair who managed to reach safety before the flood overtook them. From those two, the race of giants continued into the ages that followed. But the scale of destruction was almost total. The first act that produced the world was also an act that destroyed most of what had existed before the world. What happened next is one of the most striking things in any creation account from any tradition. Odin and his brothers took the body from Ymir's flesh. They shaped the earth. From his blood, they made the seas and the lakes and the rivers. From his bones, they built the mountains. From his teeth and the fragments of his shattered bones, they made the rocks and the boulders and the gravel that lines the beds of streams. From his hair, they made the trees. From his skull, they lifted the sky, setting it above the earth like an enormous dome. And at its four corners they placed four dwarves to hold it in place. The sources give these dwarves names that translate as north, south, east, and west. From Ymir's brain, they shaped the clouds. From his eyebrows, they fashioned a boundary around the middle region of the world, a protected zone that would eventually be called Midgard, a word that means something close to the middle enclosure, the place where humans would one day live. The world was not spoken into existence. It was not drawn up from the deep by a divine hand. It was not hatched from a cosmic egg. It was assembled from a body, from something that first had to be killed. They gathered sparks and embers from Muspelheim and set them in the sky as stars. They arranged the lights of the heavens so that they would mark time and direction for the creatures who would one day look up at them. The sources tell us something about the sun and moon that catches people off guard the first time they encounter it. In one of the surviving accounts, they were a brother and a sister, children of a man named Mundilfari, who had named them Sol and Mani, meaning sun and moon. Because they were so beautiful, the gods were displeased with this, with a man naming his children after the lights of the sky as though they were equivalent. They placed the children in the heavens and set them to work, driving the chariots that pulled the sun and moon on their daily courses. Sol drove the sun chariot fast. A wolf named Skoll was chasing her, every single day. From the first day the world was made, the sun moved across the sky at the speed of something being pursued. Her brother Mani drove the moon chariot, and he too was chased by a wolf named Hati at Ragnarok. The sources tell us, the wolves will catch them, the sky will go dark, but that is later. That is not yet. After the world was shaped and the sky was raised and the seas were filled, Odin and his brothers moved across the land they had made. They found 2 trees standing on the ground. The sources differ slightly on which trees, with some texts describing ash and elm, others varying in their details. From these trees, the 3 brothers made the first human beings. Odin gave them breath and life. Vili gave them intelligence and the ability to move with purpose. Vi gave them the senses, the ability to see and hear and speak and feel. The man they named Ask, the woman they named Embla. Ask. An Embla stood in a world made from a body. They breathed air that moved through clouds shaped from a giant's brain. They looked up at a sky that was a dead being's skull. They walked on ground that was his flesh. They drank from seas that were his blood. They did not know any of this. How could they? They had just opened their eyes for the first time. They looked at each other. and at the strange and enormous world around them. And they began, outside the walls of Midgard, in the unprotected regions beyond the boundary the brothers had built from Ymir's eyebrows. The surviving frost giants rebuilt. They settled in a region the sources call Jotunheim, and they were always out there, beyond the edge of the protected world, in the cold and the dark, representing in their very existence the chaos that had been present before the world was made, and that had never fully gone away. The void that had been Ginnungagap was no longer empty, but what filled it was not peace. It was tension, a world that had come from violence and carried that origin inside it, pressed into its mountains, dissolved in its seas, arched across its sky. The conditions for everything that was coming were already present in the ground on the day Ask and Embla first opened their eyes. The end was already in the beginning. It always had been. The world was not created from love, or light, or divine intention. It was built from a body. Picture what it would have looked like. In those first moments after Ymir fell, 3 brothers standing in a void that was still finding out what it was becoming, looking at something enormous that had just been killed. The blood was still moving, spreading outward in volumes that nothing in existence yet had words to measure. Around them, the frost giants who had come from Ymir's body were drowning in it. The flood rising faster than anything could outrun it, except for 2 who found higher ground and held on. And the 3 brothers looked at what lay before them, and they made a world from it. From flesh, earth, from blood, seas, from bone, mountains, from skull, sky. They assembled a cosmos from the materials of a body, and when they were done, it was real, and it was large, and it was lit by stars made from the sparks of Muspelheim, and it had at its centre a protected place where 2 new human beings would one day stand and look at each other and begin. The frost giants who survived watched from Jotunheim. They had come from Ymir. The world had come from Ymir. Everything that existed was made of the same material. The gods lived in a realm built from their ancestor's skull. The humans lived on land that was his flesh. The giants lived in the outer territory, always beyond the boundary of the protected world, but never fully separate from it. This is the condition of the Norse universe, not a separation between the sacred and the profane, not a clean division between order and chaos, but a deep entanglement between everything that exists, because everything that exists came from the same source. Ymir is in the sky and in the ground and in the water. He is in the clouds that are his brain and the trees that are his hair. The world the gods built is the body of the thing they killed, and the giants who press against its walls are the family of the thing it was built from. No wonder the tension never fully resolves. In the stories that survive, the moral weight of an act is carried not by whether it was sanctioned by some higher authority, but by what it demands, what it costs, and what it produces, by the honour it builds and the honour it destroys, by the oaths it creates and the oaths it breaks, by the consequences that flow from it across time, sometimes for generations, sometimes for ages. The 3 brothers were not judged for killing Ymir. They acted, and a world was the result of their acting, and the world carried inside it the nature of the act that produced it. That is the accounting the Norse cosmos keeps, not whether the first act was just, but what kind of world the first act made, and what that world demanded of everyone who lived inside it. It demanded, among other things, that you understand the ground you are standing on. Ask and Embla woke into a world already running. The stars were in place. The seas were full. The frost giants were watching from beyond the wall. They woke into the middle of a story that had been going on before them and would continue after them, and they had to figure out how to live inside it. That is not so different from the situation of every human being who has ever lived, high above Midgard, in the realm that Odin was building for the gods. The one who had initiated the killing that made the world was already beginning to understand what he had put in motion. He was already beginning to see the shape of what the world he had made was moving toward. He was already afraid of what he knew, and what he knew was not a comfortable thing to carry. The world was running. Its stars were in place. Its seas were full. Nidhogg was already in the depths below the world, already doing what Nidhogg would always do, gnawing at the root of the thing that held everything together. The wolves were already behind the sun and the moon. The conditions for everything that was coming were already present in the structure of a cosmos that had been assembled, not designed, and that carried the nature of its assembly in every part of it. The three brothers had looked at a void and turned it into a world. That is the first answer this mythology gives to the central question that will run through everything we visit tonight. If you know that what you are building will not last, do you build anyway? Three brothers standing in the blood of the first being, with a void on all sides and a cosmos in their hands. They built anyway. Most people, when they first encounter the Norse cosmos, picture something like a diagram, a tree with labelled branches, a chart showing which world sits above which other world, with neat lines connecting them and names written in boxes, something you could follow like a map, something with a clear top and a clear bottom and a logical order running through it from one end to the other. It was not that. It was an organism, a living system, and it was already dying. The tree at the centre of the Norse cosmos is called Yggdrasil. The name is usually interpreted as meaning something close to Odin's horse, a connection that comes from the old Norse practice of calling the gallows a horse, and from the story of Odin hanging himself from this very tree in his search for knowledge, which we will reach in the next part of tonight's story. The tree that holds all the worlds together is named after the act of a god nearly destroying himself to understand what the universe contained. That should tell you something about the kind of tree it is. The surviving sources that describe Yggdrasil do not give us a single consistent map of how the worlds within and around it are arranged. Scholars who work with Old Norse texts note carefully that the various accounts of the 9 worlds and their positions are not uniform across different texts and traditions. What the sources do agree on is the essential shape of the thing, an ash tree of incomprehensible size, 3 roots reaching down in 3 different directions into different regions of the cosmos, branches spreading so widely that they extend over all the worlds and reach above the sky. The 3 roots and what lay beneath them tell you almost everything you need to know about how the Norse cosmos was structured and what it was resting on. 1 root reached toward the realm of the gods, toward Asgard, and beneath this root lay a spring called Urdarbrunn, the Well of Urd. At this well sat 3 figures known as the Norns. Their names in the sources are given as Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, words that carry meanings, something like what has become, what is becoming, and what shall become. They sat at the base of the world tree and they wove. They carved into the tree itself. They tended to its roots, drawing water from the well and mixing it with the white clay around it and pouring this over the wood of Yggdrasil to slow its decay. They were the keepers of fate, the beings who recorded what had been and what was coming, in a web of threads that no other figure in the cosmos had the full sight to read. A second root reached out toward the old realm of the giants, toward Jotunheim, and beneath this root lay Mimisbrunn, the well of Mimir. Mimir is described in the surviving texts as a being of extraordinary wisdom, a keeper of a well whose waters contained understanding of a kind not available anywhere else in the cosmos. This is the well that Odin would visit, the well for which he would pay a price that we will come to shortly. The water in Mimisbrunn was not ordinary water. It had drawn something from the deepest foundation of the universe and held it in a form that could be consumed, though consuming it required giving something away that could not be recovered. The third root reached down into Niflheim, the realm of cold and mist that had existed before the world was made, and beneath this root lay Fergelmir, the same spring from which the Alivagar rivers had flowed in the time before the void had anything in it. At this root, and in this dark water, lived Nidhogg. Nidhogg is described in the surviving sources as a serpent or a dragon, a creature of immense size that lived in the depths beneath the world tree and spent its existence doing one thing, gnawing at the root, not occasionally, not when it felt the impulse, constantly. The texts are clear about this. Nidhogg was always there, always working at the root of Yggdrasil with its teeth, slowly and deliberately consuming the foundation of the tree that held all the worlds together. It had been doing this since before human memory. A passage in the Poetic Edda describes what Nidhogg does with a flatness that makes it more unsettling than any dramatic language could it choose. It has always been chewing. The root suffers for it. This is the condition of Yggdrasil, not a perfect cosmic structure maintained in pristine order by a benevolent creator. A living tree, enormous and vital and connecting everything that exists, with something eating it from below. Always, from the beginning, the tree was not healthy. It had never been entirely healthy. It was alive in the way that things are alive when they are also, simultaneously, being consumed. The Norns poured their white clay and water over it because without that constant care, the decay would spread faster than it was already spreading. With their care, the tree held. Without it, the tree would have declined far sooner. But even with their care, the gnawing continued. Other creatures lived in Yggdrasil, and their relationships with each other added to the strain of simply holding everything together. At the very top of the tree, perched among the highest branches, sat an eagle of immense age and immense wisdom, surveying all the worlds from its position at the crown. Between its eyes sat a hawk named Vedrafolnir, eyes sharp enough to see across the distances of the cosmos. At the roots of the tree, below everything, Nidhogg remained. The eagle at the top and the serpent at the bottom were enemies, which should surprise no one. But between them ran a squirrel. His name was Ratatoska. The sources describe Ratatoska as running up and down the trunk of Yggdrasil, carrying messages between the eagle at the top and Nidhogg at the bottom. But these messages were not diplomatic. Ratatoska was not trying to ease the tension between two powerful beings. He was carrying insults from the eagle down to Nidhogg, slanders from Nidhogg up to the eagle, back and forth, up and down the trunk of the world tree. A small and apparently delighted creature was spending its entire existence, making the conflict between the top and the bottom of the universe worse than it needed to be. The Norse cosmos was sustained by a tree that was being eaten from below, strained by an eagle and a serpent who hated each other, and actively destabilized by a squirrel who found the whole arrangement entertaining. It required constant maintenance from 3 ancient women at its roots just to keep it standing at the rate it was already declining. And yet it stood. It kept standing, day after day, age after age, through everything that happened in the worlds it contained. Yggdrasil kept standing, its roots drawing water and nourishment, its branches extending over everything, its bark scarred and its roots damaged and something always chewing at it from the darkness below. Now consider the worlds that the tree held together. The sources do not give us a single perfectly consistent list of all 9, and different texts arrange them in ways that do not always match. What the surviving material does give us is a sense of the major realms and their relationships. Asgard was among them, the realm of the Aesir gods, connected to the middle world by the burning bridge of Bifrost, high and bright and protective of its position. Asgard was where Odin kept his hall and his high seat, where the gods held their councils, where the preparations for the end of the world were already underway in ways we will come to in time. Midgard sat at the centre, the protected middle world where humans lived, the place made from Ymir's eyebrows where Ask and Embla had stood and looked at each other on the first morning of human existence. Jotunheim lay in the outer regions, the vast and cold home of the frost giants. Niflheim was down in the depths, the realm of ice and mist, and within it, or near it, lay Hel, the realm of the dead, presided over by a figure who shared its name. Muspelheim was still burning as it had always burned, as it had burned before Ymir, before the void had been anything but a void. Vanaheim was the home of the Vanir, a separate family of divine beings whose relationship to the Aesir we will come to in a later part of tonight's story. Alfheim was associated with the Light Elves. Svartalfheim, or in some accounts Nidavellir, was the realm of the dwarves, the master craftsmen of the Norse cosmos whose work was essential to the gods in ways that will become clear later tonight. 9 worlds, in the surviving tradition. held within and connected to a single ash tree of impossible size. The exact arrangement varies across sources. What does not vary is the essential nature of what Yggdrasil was, not a fixed and perfect structure, but a living thing under constant pressure that had not yet fallen. The central question of tonight's story, the one we will keep returning to, is not whether Ragnarok will come. The sources are clear that it will, and the world the tree holds together will face fire and flood and collapse. What happens to the tree itself in that final fire is something the surviving sources handle with less certainty, and we will return to that when we reach the end of everything. For now, the question that matters is what it means to tend the roots of something you know is going to be tested, what it means to keep pouring the white clay and the water over a tree that is being eaten from below, what it means to build halls and tell stories and love people and face what comes at you. In a universe where the shape of things is already moving toward its limit, the Norns sat at the well of Erd and they wove and they carved and they worked. They did not appear, in the sources, to be doing this because they believed it would save the tree forever. They appeared to be doing it because it was what there was to do, because the tree was there, and it was alive, and it needed tending, and so they tended it. That is a very Norse answer to a very old question. Far above them, in the branches that extended over all the worlds, the eagle watched. Below the roots, in the cold dark of Niflheim, Nidhogg chewed, and up and down the trunk of the world, small and quick and endlessly busy, Ratatoskar carried its poison in both directions, making sure that the beings at the top and the beings at the bottom would never find peace with each other. The cosmos was not a diagram. It was an argument, a living argument between forces that could not coexist and could not separate, held together inside the body of a tree that was slowly losing the contest with what had been eating it since before. Most of the worlds it contained had come into existence, and somewhere in the branches of that tree, in the realm that Odin was building above all the others, a god was preparing to do something that would cost him more than almost anything else in the history of the Norse cosmos. He had already made up his mind. He was already afraid of what he knew, and he had decided that being afraid was not a reason to stop. Odin did not seek wisdom because he was wise. He sought it because he was afraid of what he already knew. That distinction matters. It changes everything about how you understand him. In many traditions, the figure at the top of the divine hierarchy is defined by completeness, a god who knows everything, who sees everything, who requires nothing because he already possesses the full picture of what the universe contains. Odin is not that figure. He is almost the opposite of that figure. He is a god defined by what he does not yet know, by the gaps in his understanding that he is willing to pay extraordinary prices to fill, and by the creeping awareness that even after all the payments he has made, there are still things coming that he cannot prevent. He had one eye. The sources tell us that Odin gave up the other one willingly, deliberately, at a spring called Mimisbrunn, the well of Mimir, which lay beneath one of the three roots of Yggdrasil, the root that reached toward the realm of the giants. Mimir is described in the surviving texts as a being of immense wisdom, a keeper of a well whose waters contained understanding of a kind not available anywhere else in the cosmos. The well was fed by one of the roots of the world tree itself, drawing something from the deepest foundation of the universe and holding it in water that looked ordinary but was not ordinary at all. Odin came to this well and asked to drink. Mimir told him the price. To drink from the well, Odin would have to give up one of his eyes, place it in the well, leave it there, walk away from it forever. Odin agreed. He took out his own eye and placed it in the water and drank what Mimir offered him, and then he left, with one eye, carrying inside him whatever the well had contained. The sources do not describe in precise terms what knowledge he gained from this act. They leave it as something vast and unnamed, a deepening of understanding that went beyond what ordinary experience could give him. What they make clear is that Odin did not hesitate. There is no account of him standing at the edge of the well wrestling with the decision. No record of him asking for more time or a lower price. He paid what was asked, and he took what was offered, and he left. His eye remains in the well. The sources tell us. It is still there, at the bottom of Mimir's in the dark water beneath the root of Yggdrasil. The eye of Odin sits and sees. And what it sees in the depths of that well is something the texts do not describe because perhaps there are no words for it. But even that was not enough for him. There was a second price Odin paid for knowledge, and this one was paid on the tree itself. The runes were not simply an alphabet in the Norse understanding of them, as the surviving sources describe it. They were something closer to the fundamental forces of the cosmos made visible, symbols that, if understood completely, gave the one who understood them a form of power over the things they represented. They were not invented by anyone in the ordinary sense. They were discovered, drawn out of the fabric of the universe by someone willing to go to the place where they could be found. That place was Yggdrasil. Odin describes what he did in one of the poems of the Poetic Edda, in a passage that has a quality unlike almost anything else in the surviving sources. He says that he hung himself on the windy tree. He says that he hung there for 9 nights. He says that he was wounded with a spear, that he was offered to Odin, himself to himself, given to no one. On that tree whose roots run in places no one fully knows, he says that no one gave him bread and no one gave him a drink from a horn. He says that he peered downward, and he took up the runes. Screaming, he took them up, and then he fell back down from the tree. 9 nights on Yggdrasil, wounded, alone, without food or water, hanging in the cold and the wind on the same tree that Nidhogg was eating from below and the eagle was watching from above, and the squirrel was running up and down in its endless circuit between hatred and more hatred. He did this to himself. No one forced him. No one asked him to. He chose this as the price of understanding what the runes contained. The sources do not dwell on what those 9 nights felt like. They do not slow down to examine the pain or the hunger or the long hours when nothing happened, and the tree just moved in the wind above him, and the darkness below him was absolute. The poem gives you the essential facts and leaves you to fill in the space around them, which is perhaps the most effective thing a poem can do. You can feel the weight of those 9 nights without being told exactly what they weighed. After the runes, Odin grew in what he could do and what he could understand. He learned a form of working called cider, a practice connected to seeing what was coming and to shaping events. A practice that carried in the Norse context associations that made it complicated for certain figures to engage with openly, which tells you something about how willing Odin was to pay whatever price knowledge required, regardless of what that cost him in other ways. He learned charms the Poetic Edda describes in tantalizing half detail, giving you enough to understand their scope without fully explaining what they did. He was becoming the most knowing being in the cosmos, and he was becoming more afraid with everything he learned, because the things he was learning were not reassuring. They were the things you learn when you look directly at the structure of a universe that was made from a killing and is heading toward an ending, and you understand clearly what the shape of that arc means. The more Odin understood, the more clearly he could see what was coming, and the more clearly he could see what was coming, the more urgently he needed to understand still more. It was a wheel with no exit. He sent his 2 ravens out into the world every morning. Their names were Hugin and Munin, and these names translate from Old Norse as something like thought and memory, concepts so central to what Odin valued that he named the birds who carried information back to him after the very faculties that made him who he was. Every morning, Hugin and Munin left Odin's shoulder and flew out over all the worlds, seeing what there was to see, hearing what there was to hear, gathering the information that Odin needed to keep his understanding of the cosmos current, and every morning, Odin watched them go. The Poetic Edda contains a line that is worth holding for a moment. Odin says that he worries about Hugin, that he fears Hugin may not return to him, but, he says, he worries more about Munin. He worries more about memory than about thought. Consider what that means. The most powerful figure in the Norse cosmos, the god who sacrificed his eye and hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights and learned the runes and knows more than any other being in any of the 9 worlds, begins each day afraid, not afraid of giants, Not afraid of monsters, not afraid of any particular enemy, afraid that the birds will not come back, afraid that what he has gathered and what he remembers will be lost, afraid that memory itself will fail to return to him before the end. This is Odin, as the sources give him to us. Not a figure of untroubled authority, not a king sitting comfortably on a throne that nothing can threaten, a being who knows too much to be at peace, who has paid too much to stop paying, and who sends thought and memory out into the world each morning with the knowledge that the day might come when one or both of them does not return. That is a very specific kind of loneliness. It is the loneliness of someone who has looked clearly at what is coming and found no comfort in the looking, only clarity, and who has decided that clarity, however painful, is preferable to the alternative. Odin had a hall called Valhalla. The sources describe it as a vast hall where warriors who died in battle were brought by the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, to feast and fight and feast again. He was gathering an army. He was gathering it because he already knew what was coming, and he intended to face it with everything he could assemble. Every warrior who died well on a battlefield and was chosen by the Valkyries came to Valhalla. They feasted each evening. During the day they fought each other, hard and real, wounds and all. And when the fighting was done, they healed and came back inside. They were training. Odin was maintaining them, feeding them, keeping them ready. Because at Ragnarok he would need every one of them. He knew it would not be enough. He knew this clearly. He could see the shape of what was coming, and he knew that the army he was building and the ravens he was sending out, and the knowledge he had purchased with his eye and his 9 nights on the tree would not, in the end, prevent what was going to happen. He built Valhalla anyway. He sent the ravens out anyway. He paid for knowledge he already knew would not save him. That is the thing about Odin, that the sources keep returning to across different stories and different poems and different forms. He is not trying to escape what is coming. He is trying to face it with everything he has. He is trying to understand it as completely as any being has ever understood anything, so that when the moment arrives, he will have been as present to it as it is possible to be. There is a quality in that which is very difficult to name. It is not heroism in the conventional sense, because heroism usually implies some hope that the hero will prevail. It is something more austere than that, something more honest, a willingness to look at the full picture without flinching and to keep going anyway. Not because going will change the outcome, but because stopping would mean something worse than whatever is at the end of the road. Every morning, 2 ravens left his shoulder. Every morning, he watched them go. And every morning, as the light came up over Asgard and the world stirred in the branches of the tree that was slowly being eaten from below, Odin sat with what he knew and what he feared losing, and he waited for them to come back. If tonight's journey through the Norse cosmos is the kind of history you want drifting through your mind as you fall asleep, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you might think. And if you want to let us know where you are listening from tonight, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Whether it is late on the East Coast or a quiet evening somewhere further west, someone else who cannot sleep tonight will find their way here because of you. Kings prayed to Odin. Farmers called on Thor. That difference mattered more than most mythology books admit. It is easy. When you look at the Norse pantheon as a list of names and powers, to see Odin at the top and assume that he was the god who mattered most to the people who built this mythology. He is the All-Father. He sits on the high seat called Hlidskjalf, from which he can see all the worlds. He is the one who sacrificed and suffered and accumulated knowledge at a cost that no other being in the cosmos was willing to pay, in terms of raw narrative weight, in terms of the sheer volume of the sources devoted to him. Odin is enormous, but when you look at the physical evidence that survives from the Viking Age and the centuries around it, a different picture comes into focus. Thor's hammer, the symbol of Mjolnir, appears with striking frequency on amulets and pendants and carved stones across Scandinavia and Iceland. The name Thor appears widely in place names and personal names throughout the regions where Norse culture spread and settled, woven into the landscape and into the human record in ways that suggest something about where ordinary people placed their daily attention and their daily trust. the day of the week that carries his name, Thursday, which was Thorsdagur in the Old Norse languages, survived the passage of centuries and languages and remains in use today in every English-speaking country in the world. Odin was real to people. Odin was powerful and respected and feared, but Thor was close. The distinction the surviving sources draw between these two figures is not a simple one of strong and clever, or noble and common. It is a distinction between two different kinds of divine concern, two different ranges of what a god paid attention to and what a god was available for. Odin's concerns, as the sources present them, run toward wisdom, poetry, war at the level of fate and strategy, and the long preparation for what he already knows is coming. He moves among kings and warriors and poets. He appears in disguise. He gives gifts that come with costs attached. He is interested in the exceptional and the fated, in the figures whose deaths will add something to what he is assembling in Valhalla. His attention is always on the long view, on the shape of the arc from creation to Ragnarok, on what can be understood and prepared for even if it cannot be prevented. Thor's attention runs toward the immediate and the concrete, toward the boundaries that keep the inhabited world safe from what lies beyond them, toward the specific and present threat of giants moving too close to where people lived, toward the weather that determined whether the fishing boats came back and whether the harvest came in, toward the basic conditions of ordinary life that needed protecting every single season without exception. Thor drove a chariot pulled by two goats named Tangrisnir and Tangjosta, whose names mean something like teeth, bearer and teeth, grinder in Old Norse. The rolling of this chariot across the sky was understood as the sound of thunder, and the lightning was Mjolnir being swung. When a storm came in from the sea and the thunder rolled over the fjords and the fields, that was not simply weather, that was Thor, working, and working was the key word. Thor was not a distant figure contemplating large abstract questions from a high seat. He was constantly moving, constantly dealing with the immediate problem, constantly on his way somewhere to deal with a giant that had come too close to the boundary or made a claim that needed answering. The sources give us a Thor who is almost always in motion, always engaged with the practical and urgent business of keeping the inhabited world intact. He was not subtle. The sources are quite clear about this, and seem to find it appealing rather than limiting. Thor solved problems directly. When there was a giant to be dealt with, he dealt with it. When something threatened the boundary between Midgard and the chaos beyond it, he went to that boundary and he stood at it. His approach was not the layered and oblique method of his father. It was more direct than that, more immediate, more legible to people who were themselves dealing with immediate and direct problems, who were not contemplating the fate of the cosmos in abstract, but were trying to get through a winter. Mjolnir deserves a moment, because what it was used for tells you something important about what Thor meant to ordinary people. The hammer was made by dwarves, the master craftsmen of the 9 worlds, and we will come to the specific story of how it was made later tonight. What matters here is what it was used for beyond the killing of giants. The same hammer that defended the boundary of the inhabited world was the hammer invoked at rituals of blessing, when a marriage needed to be marked as sacred, when a new life needed to be welcomed into the community, when a death needed to be honoured in the proper way. Mjolnir was invoked. Thor's power was not separated from ordinary life into some distant sacred realm. It was present in the moments that structured human experience, in births and deaths and marriages and the turning of seasons. The weapon of the boundary was also the instrument of the hearth. There are stories in the surviving sources of Thor's journeys into Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, that have a quality quite different from the grander cosmic narratives. In these stories, Thor travels into territory that belongs to beings far larger and stranger than anything in Midgard, and he encounters challenges that test not just his strength, but his understanding of where his power begins and ends. One of these stories, preserved in the Prose Edda, involves a hall in Jotunheim whose owner turned out to be a giant of unusual cunning. The giant, whose name was Utgard. Loki set the visitors a series of challenges: an eating contest, a drinking contest, a wrestling match against an old woman. These sound like simple tests of appetite and strength, but they were not. The eating contest was against fire itself. The drinking horn was connected to the ocean. The old woman was old age. And no one defeats old age in a wrestling match. Thor did not win any of these contests. But when the truth was revealed the next morning, when Utgard, Loki explained what had actually been at stake. The giant said something that the sources seemed to want you to hear. He said that in all his experience, he had never seen anyone come as close as Thor had come. He said it with what the sources describe as relief. Relief that Thor had not known the full truth of what he was doing. Because if he had, the consequences would have been unmanageable. That is a very particular kind of tribute. Not you won, but we are genuinely glad you did not understand what you were actually doing. Thor walked away from that story without the victory he had come for. He walked back toward Midgard with Mjolnir in his hand, and the knowledge that the world was stranger than even his enormous direct experience had fully accounted for. He did not seem, in the way the sources describe it, to find this discouraging. He went on to the next thing that needed doing, which is also a very particular quality. The quality of a being for whom discouragement is less available than motion. He was always heading somewhere, always dealing with the immediate problem, always standing at whatever boundary needed standing at, and the people who wore his hammer around their necks, who called on him in storms and at weddings and at the turning of seasons, who gave their sons names that carried his name inside them, were calling on that quality as much as anything else. Not the wisdom that came from sacrifice and suffering, not the long view from the high seat above all the worlds, just the assurance that whatever was coming in from outside the boundary, whatever was pressing at the wall between the inhabited world and the chaos beyond it, there was something large and determined and not particularly interested in being stopped that was already heading toward it. The thunder rolled across the sky. The hammer always came back. For the people in the farmhouses and the fishing boats and the small settlements at the edges of the inhabitable world, that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly what they needed. The very first war in Norse mythology was not fought between gods and monsters. It was fought between two groups of gods, and it ended with neither side winning. The war began with a woman who could not be killed. Her name in the surviving sources is Gullveig, and she appears in the Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy, one of the oldest and most difficult poems in the Poetic Edda. The poem is dense and scholars continue to debate exactly what it describes. But what emerges from those difficult lines is this. A figure named Gullveig came among the Aesir, and the Aesir burned her. 3 times they put her into the fire. 3 times she rose from it, whole, and the 3rd time she rose, she had become something different. A figure of cider magic and prophecy called Hyde. Welcomed wherever she went among people who valued what she knew, she could not be destroyed. Many readings of this passage connect Gullveig with the Vanir, seeing her arrival as the inciting event of the war between the two families of gods. The poem does not make this explicit, and scholars approach the passage with care. But what is clear, in whatever form the conflict began, is that a war followed, and the two families of gods fought. The Aesir were the gods we have already begun to meet. Odin with his eye in Mimir's well, and his ravens on his shoulders. Thor with his hammer and his goats and his constant motion toward whatever boundary needed defending. They were gods of a particular character, connected to the sky and the hall, to war at the level of fate and strategy, to wisdom that cost something to obtain and power that announced itself directly. The Vanir were different in almost every way that mattered. They were connected to the earth, to the sea, to the cycles of growth and harvest, and the turning of seasons that made ordinary life possible. Their magic was a different kind from the direct power of the Aesir, associated with Sidra, with seeing beneath surfaces, with the slow processes that a farmer understands in the body from years of working the same land. They moved along the grain of what was already present rather than imposing something new from above. 3 figures from the Vanir stand at the centre of what they were and what they brought to the world. Njord came first, a god of the sea and of seafaring, of the prosperity that flows from water, from the fish that come when the nets go out, and from the safe return of boats that have gone into uncertain weather. He was the father, and his children were the ones who would matter most in everything that followed. His daughter was Freya. Picture her not as a name in a list, but as a presence, because the sources describe her in terms that resist easy summarization. She was associated with love and with desire, with a beauty the sources describe as something more than physical, and with a form of magic so powerful that even Odin, who had hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain knowledge, sought to learn it from her. She had a hall called Sessrumnir, and she received into it half of the warriors who died in battle. Half went to Odin's Valhalla, half went to Freya. She was a goddess of love who kept half of the war dead. The Norse cosmos did not sort its divine concerns into clean categories that excluded each other. She wore a necklace called Brisingamen, obtained through a bargain the sources describe and debate. She had a cloak of falcon feathers that gave the power of flight to whoever wore it. She rode a chariot pulled by cats. When she wept, the sources say, she wept tears of red gold. She was one of the most fully realized figures in the Norse pantheon, and she came to Asgard as part of the peace that ended a war. Her brother was Freya. He was the god of sunshine and rain, of the conditions that made the earth produce, of the good harvest and the fair weather that allowed communities to survive and grow through the seasons. He was given Alfheim, the realm of the light elves, as a gift when he cut his first tooth, which tells you something about the scale at which gods gave things to each other in the Norse cosmos. He also carried a sword, and this sword matters more than anything else about Freya, though the reason it matters will not become fully clear until much later in tonight's story. It was a sword that could fight on its own, that could swing itself against enemies without a hand to guide it. He carried it through all the ages of the world, until the moment he gave it away. That moment is coming. Not yet. The war between the Aesir and the Vanir, as the sources describe it, did not end with one side destroying the other. The two families fought, and neither could deliver the decisive blow that would have settled the question. What they reached instead was an exhaustion, a recognition that the fighting was producing nothing either side could keep, and so they made peace, in the way that serious agreements between serious powers were made in the Norse world. Through the exchange of hostages, representatives of each side would go to live among the former enemy, a living guarantee that the agreement was real. The Aesir sent 2 figures to Vanaheim. One was Honir, tall and impressive in appearance, exactly the kind of figure that seemed like the right choice for a diplomatic representative. The other was Mimir, the keeper of the Well of Wisdom, one of the most genuinely valuable beings in the Norse cosmos. The Vanir quickly discovered that Honir could not make decisions on his own. Without Mimir beside him to counsel him, Honir defaulted to telling others to decide. He looked like authority and contained none. The Vanir felt deceived. They cut off Mimir's head and sent it back to Odin. Odin preserved the head. He treated it with herbs and spoke preservation charms over it. And the head of Mimir continued to speak, continued to offer counsel from beyond death. And Odin continued to consult it through all the ages that followed. The sources mention this almost as a practical matter. The most valuable counselor in the cosmos had been decapitated in a diplomatic dispute, and the appropriate response was to preserve the head and continue the conversations. From the Vanir, the Aesir received Njord and his children. Freya and Freya came to Asgard. They brought with them their magic and their connection to the earth and the sea and the turning year. In time, these things became part of what Asgard was, woven into the character of the divine order alongside the sky. Power and the martial directness that the Aesir had always carried. The war had ended not with winners and losers, but with a merger. 2 families who had been fighting became, over time, one family. When you look at Asgard as the mythology presents it, with Odin and Thor alongside Freya and Njord, you are looking at something that was built from a conflict, that contains its own history of war inside it, the way a healed bone sometimes carries the mark of its break within its structure. The integration was real, but it was never quite frictionless. Saedra, The magic that Freya practiced and that Odin learned from her carried associations in the surviving sources that created complications for certain figures who engaged with it openly. The different natures of the two families never fully dissolved into harmony. They settled into coexistence, which is a different thing, and the difference between coexistence and harmony would matter more as the world moved toward its end. Freyr had come to Asgard carrying his remarkable sword. He would remain there through all the ages that followed. He would be present at Ragnarok, and at Ragnarok, his sword would not be in his hand. The reason for that is a story that belongs to a later part of tonight's telling. For now, it is enough to know that the first war in the mythological order ended not with one kind of power defeating another, but with both kinds of power learning to live inside the same walls, carrying their different natures into a shared future that neither had chosen alone. That future had a name everyone in Asgard already knew. No one was ready for it anyway. Every mythology needs one figure who breaks the rules, a being who exists at the edge of whatever order has been established, who moves between categories that are supposed to be fixed, who makes the structure of the cosmos visible precisely by finding the places where it can be bent or broken or temporarily suspended, a figure whose presence is, depending on the moment, absolutely necessary and absolutely catastrophic. Norse mythology gave that role to Loki, and then discovered it could not survive him. He was not a villain in the way that word has come to function in modern storytelling. He was not a being of pure malevolent intent whose every action was directed toward a single dark purpose. He was something considerably more uncomfortable than that. He was a figure who could not be reliably categorized, who sat at the intersection of helpful and destructive, of loyal and treacherous, of inside and outside, in ways that made him indispensable right up until the moment he became the instrument of everything falling apart. The sources describe Loki's origins in ways that set him apart from the Aesir from the beginning. His father was a giant named Farbuti, a word that carries meaning something like cruel striker in Old Norse. His mother was a figure named Laufey, and it is notable that Loki is typically referred to in the sources by his mother's name rather than his father's, called Loki Laufeyjarson, a reversal of the usual convention that scholars have noted and interpreted in various ways without arriving at a single conclusion. He was not born of the divine family. He came from outside it, and yet he was blood, brother to Odin himself, bound by an oath the sources mention but do not fully explain, an oath that placed him inside the inner circle of Asgard despite everything about his nature that suggested he belonged somewhere else. He was beautiful, the sources say, strikingly so. He was also capable of changing his shape into almost anything he chose, a quality that appears throughout the stories as both his greatest asset and the root of his most consequential actions. He moved between forms the way most beings move between rooms, with a fluency that made the boundaries between categories seem arbitrary when applied to him. He was, by almost any measure, the most useful being in Asgard when things went wrong in ways that required something other than direct force to resolve. Consider the matter of Sif's hair. Sif was the wife of Thor, and she had golden hair that the sources describe as remarkable. One night, while she slept, someone cut it off, all of it, close to her head. She woke Sean, and the someone who had done it was Loki. The sources do not explain why at length. There is no stated motive, no elaborate chain of events that led to the cutting. It happened with a quality that runs through many of Loki's actions, a kind of purposefulness, as though something in his nature produced the act without requiring a reason that could be articulated. He cut the hair of Thor's wife while she slept, and then Thor found out, and the situation became immediately serious. Thor's response was direct in the way that Thor's responses to things tended to be direct. He told Loki that the hair would be replaced. Real hair. Golden hair. Hair that would grow as natural hair grows. And that Loki would be the one to arrange this, or the consequences would be significant and immediate. Loki went to the realm of the dwarves. He went specifically to a pair of craftsmen known as the Sons of Ivaldi, makers of extraordinary skill whose work the sources describe as being without equal. He commissioned from them 3 objects. First, New hair for Sif, made of real gold, that would grow naturally once placed on her head. Second, the ship Skidbladnir for Freya, a vessel large enough to carry all the gods with their weapons and armour, but able to be folded, when not in use, to fit inside a small pouch. Third, the spear Gungnir for Odin, a spear that never missed its mark. The sons of Ivaldi produced all three. The hair was perfect. The ship was perfect. The spear was perfect. A reasonable person in Loki's position would have returned to Asgard with the gifts and considered the debt cleared. But Loki was not built for the straightforward exit when a more complex option was available. He went to another dwarf, a figure named Brock, and he made a bet. His own head against Brock's skill. Loki wagered that Brock and his brother Sindri could not produce three objects equal in quality to what the sons of Ivaldi had made. Brock accepted. What followed in the forge is one of the most specific and tactile scenes in the surviving sources. Sindri placed a pigskin in the forge and told Brock to work the bellows and not to stop for any reason until he returned. Brock worked the bellows. Something settled on his hand and bit him. He kept working. Sindri returned and pulled from the forge a golden boar, its bristles shining so brightly it could light the darkest places. The boar would be Freya's. Sindri placed gold in the forge. Brock worked the bellows again. Something bit him on the arm. Harder this time. He kept working. Sindri returned and pulled from the forge the ring Draupnir, a gold ring that would drip 8 rings of equal weight every 9 nights. The ring would be Odin's. Sindri placed iron in the forge. He told Brock to work the bellows and absolutely not to stop. This time, what settled on Brock went for his eyelid. It bit hard enough that blood ran down into his eye. Brock stopped pumping for just a moment, just long enough to knock the creature away. Before resuming, Sindri returned and pulled from the forge a hammer. The hammer was Mjolnir. It was perfect except for one thing. The handle was slightly shorter than it should have been, because Brock had stopped working the bellows for the moment it took to deal with what had been biting his eyelid, and the creature that had been biting him, first his hand during the boar, then his arm during the ring, then his eyelid during the hammer, was Loki, in the shape of a fly, doing exactly what Loki always did, finding the one intervention that would change the outcome. Inserting himself into a process he had set in motion to ensure the result was not quite what it could have been. Despite the short handle, when the objects were presented to the gods in Asgard and the quality of the work was judged, the verdict was that Mjolnir won. Brock won the bet. Loki's head was forfeit, Loki pointed out, when Brock came to collect, that the bet had specified his head but said nothing about his neck. He would not consent to any method of taking his head that involved harming his neck. This was exactly the kind of argument Loki was capable of making, and that was, technically, unanswerable. Brock could not take the head without the neck. What Brock did instead was sew Loki's lips shut with an awl. Loki eventually worked the stitching free. He always found the way out of the immediate situation. The longer consequences of his actions were another matter. Loki had children with Asgard. Born figures. Ordinary enough in the context of the cosmos, but he also had 3 children with a giantess named Angrboda, whose name carries meanings something like the one who brings grief, or the harbinger of sorrow in Old Norse. The first child was Fenrir, a wolf who grew at a rate that alarmed the gods immediately. They tried to bind him with iron chains. The first chain, called lading, Fenrir broke without apparent effort. The second, called Dromi, and considerably stronger, he broke the same way. The gods went to the dwarves, because what was needed was not a stronger version of what had already failed, but something constructed from a different principle entirely. The dwarves made a ribbon called Gleipnir, fashioned from 6 things that do not exist in the world: the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, because these things do not exist. The ribbon made from them could not be broken by anything that does exist. Fenrir was suspicious. He agreed to allow the binding only if one of the gods would place a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Only one god stepped forward. His name was Tyr, a god associated with law and with single combat. And everyone present understood clearly what placing a hand in Fenrir's mouth was going to cost him. Fenrir could not break Gleipnir. The gods did not release him. Tyr lost his hand. Fenrir lay on his island, a sword propped in his open jaws, waiting. The second child was Jormungandr, a serpent. The gods cast it into the ocean that surrounds Midgard. It grew until it encircled the entire world, until it could reach its own tail with its mouth, holding itself in a circle around everything that existed. It lay in the deep water at the edge of the world, waiting. The third child was Hel. Odin sent her to Niflheim and gave her authority over the dead, over all those who died in the ordinary ways, of illness and age and accident, the deaths that were not the kind that sent a warrior to Valhalla. She presided over that cold and quiet realm, half the colour of life and half the colour of the dead in her appearance, receiving the dead as they came. Through all of this, Loki remained in Asgard, still useful, still solving problems that no one else could solve in the ways he could solve them. The arrangement that had held for so long was held together by usefulness on one side and tolerance on the other, and both of those things had limits. The limits were closer than anyone had named out loud. They were about to be reached. Baldr was the brightest thing in Norse mythology, and that was exactly why his death changed everything. He was Odin's son, born into a cosmos that already carried its ending inside it, already moving through the long arc from the killing of Ymir toward the fire that Surt would bring from Muspelheim when the last age arrived. He was born into a world where the wolf was chained but growing, where the serpent lay coiled around everything, where the ravens went out each morning and came back with news that was never entirely reassuring. And yet, somehow, Baldr was not darkened by any of this. The sources describe him in terms that stand apart from how they describe almost anyone else in the Norse cosmos. He was radiant. He was fair in face and so bright that light came from him. He was the best of the gods, the sources say, and the wisest, and the most gentle. And all things praised him. He was not naive. That is important to understand. Baldr was not an innocent who did not know what world he lived in. He was a being who knew exactly what world he lived in and who managed, within that world, to be something that the world did not make easy. He was good in a cosmos that did not guarantee goodness would be rewarded or protected or allowed to persist. He shone in a place that was always moving toward darkness. And then he began to dream about his own death. The dreams came repeatedly, with the quality that the sources associate with true prophecy rather than ordinary sleep. They were not vague or symbolic. They were direct and clear, and they showed Baldr what was coming for him. And they frightened him in a way that nothing else in the sources shows Baldr being frightened. He told the other gods what he had seen. The news moved through Asgard with the weight of something that everyone recognized immediately as serious. Because in the Norse cosmos, a prophetic dream did not describe one possible future among many. It described what was going to happen. Odin took the threat seriously in the way that Odin took everything seriously, which is to say, with a thoroughness that went further than anyone else would have gone. He rode Sleipnir down to Hel, to the realm of the dead in the depths below the world, to seek out a dead seeress and ask her directly what was coming. The sources describe this journey in the Poetic Edda with a detail and a texture that makes it one of the most affecting passages in the surviving material. Odin rode down through worlds that grew darker and colder the further he went, past the dog that guarded the entrance to Hel's realm, a dog named Garm, whose chest was bloody and who bayed at the visitor from the world of the living. He reached the grave of the seeress and woke her from her death with charms, and she answered his questions unwillingly. Pulled back into speech by forces she could not resist, she told him that Baldr was coming to Hel, that the hall was already being prepared for him, the benches already laid out, the mead already brewed. She told him enough that Odin understood completely what was coming, and then she refused to say more, and she went back into the silence of the dead. And Odin rode back up through the darkening worlds toward Asgard, with knowledge that was exactly as terrible as he had feared it would be. Meanwhile, Frigg had her own response to the dreams. Frigg was Odin's wife, and the sources present her action in response to Baldr's danger as something undertaken with absolute determination and extraordinary scope. She went to everything in all the worlds and asked it to swear an oath that it would not harm Baldr, not just to living creatures, to everything, stone and metal and wood and fire and water and disease and poison, and every creature that walked or flew or swam. She went to all of it, and she extracted the promise she needed. And when she was done, the gods tested what she had accomplished by standing in a circle around Baldr and throwing things at him. Nothing landed. Stones bounced away. Spears stopped short. Weapons of every kind failed to make contact. Baldr stood in the middle of the circle and nothing could touch him. And the gods found something in this that was close to relief. The relief of seeing with your own eyes that the thing you were most afraid of could not get through. Loki watched this. The sources do not give us his internal state during these games. They do not explain what he felt while he stood among the gods and watched weapons fail to harm the brightest figure in Asgard. What they give us is what he did next, which tells you something about him that no internal explanation could improve on. He disguised himself. He took the shape of a woman and went to find Frigg, and he spoke to her in the way that a curious visitor might speak to someone they had just met, asking about the remarkable thing happening in Asgard where nothing seemed able to harm one of the gods. Frigg, in the warmth of what she had accomplished, talked to this stranger about what she had done. She had gone to everything. She said she had asked everything to swear. Everything had sworn. Loki asked whether everything really meant everything, whether there was anything she had not gotten to. Frigg mentioned, almost as an aside, that there was one thing she had not asked, a small plant that grew to the west of Valhalla, young and slight and seemingly harmless. It was called mistletoe. She had not asked it to swear because it seemed too young, too small, too inconsequential to be worth the trouble of the journey. Loki left. He went to find the mistletoe. He cut a branch of it and shaped it into something that could be thrown. He came back to the games. Among the gods gathered around Baldr was a figure named Hodra. Hodra was Baldr's brother, and he was blind, and he stood at the edge of the circle of gods who were throwing things at Baldr and not participating, because he could not see where to throw and had nothing to throw in any case. Loki went to Hod. He offered to guide his hand. He said that Hodra should join the game, that it was only right that he participate in honouring his brother with the others. He placed the mistletoe shaft in Hodra's hands and he positioned him, and he told him where to throw. Hodra threw. The mistletoe found Baldr. He fell. The sources describe the moment that followed as a silence unlike any other silence that had ever fallen in Asgard. The gods stood and looked at what had happened and could not immediately process it, because it was the thing they had been most afraid of and had believed they had prevented. And it had happened anyway, through a gap so small and so seemingly insignificant that no one had thought to guard it, through a plant too young to bother asking, through a blind god who had only wanted to participate, through Loki, who had listened carefully to the one piece of information that mattered and had known exactly what to do with it. Then the grief came, and it was total. The sources describe the gods weeping in a way the texts reserve for very few moments. Everything in the worlds mourned for Baldr, which is a statement that carries an enormous weight when you consider that everything in the worlds had just sworn to protect him. Odin's grief was the deepest, because Odin understood most clearly what Baldr's death meant, not just the loss of a son he loved, the loss of what Baldr represented, the confirmation that the dreams had been true, and that the sequence they described was now in motion. Baldr dead meant that the line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, that the world had passed through the point of no return, that everything from here forward was the movement of things that had been set in motion long ago and could no longer be redirected. A god named Hermod volunteered to ride to Hel and ask for Baldr back. Odin gave him Sleipnir. Hermod rode the same path Odin had ridden, down through the darkening worlds, across the river Jol on its gold, roofed bridge, into the realm of Hel itself. He found Baldr there, seated in the place of honour at Hel's table, because even in death Baldr was the best of those present, and the accommodation reflected it. He asked Hel to release Baldr. He explained the grief that had fallen over all the worlds. Hel told him the terms. If everything in all the worlds truly wept for Baldr, every living thing and every dead thing, and everything that existed in any form, if not one thing in all of creation refused to mourn him, then she would release him. Hermod rode back, and the gods sent messengers everywhere, to every corner of every realm, asking everything to weep for Baldr, and everything did. Stone wept, metal wept, trees wept, the creatures of the land and sea and sky wept. The condition was being met, one weeping thing at a time. Then the messengers found a giantess sitting in a cave. Her name, the sources give her, was Thok. She sat alone, and when the messengers told her about Baldr and asked her to weep, she refused. She said that Baldr had never done anything for her. She said, let Hel keep what she has. She had no tears to give, the sources suggest. And most readers of the Norse texts have understood this to be true. That Thok was Loki in disguise. He had killed Baldr with mistletoe thrown by a blind god's hand. And now, when the condition for Baldr's return was the weeping of everything in all the worlds, he sat in a cave in the shape of a giantess and refused to weep. One thing that would not mourn was enough to break the condition. Baldr stayed in Hel. The preparation for his funeral had been happening while Hermod rode his long round trip. And when it became clear that Baldr was not coming back, what had been preparation became the event itself. His ship was there, a ship called Hringhorni, described in the sources as the greatest of all ships. The gods intended to launch it and burn it with Baldr's body on the funeral pyre built on its deck, but the ship was so large that they could not move it from the shore. They sent for a giantess named Hirukin, a being of such strength that she arrived riding a wolf and using a serpent for reins. She put her shoulder to the ship and pushed once, with a force so great that fire sprang from the rollers beneath the hull and the earth shook. The ship moved. They placed Baldr on the pyre. His wife, a goddess named Nanna, died of grief when she saw her husband laid out for burning, and they placed her beside him. Odin walked to the ship before it was set alight and bent close to Baldr and spoke something into his son's ear. And the sources do not tell us what he said. It is one of the very few things in all the surviving Norse texts that is deliberately withheld, a secret between a father and a son that passed from the living world into the fire and was not preserved in any text that has come down to us. Thor consecrated the pyre with Mjolnir, the same gesture that the hammer performed at weddings and births. The same blessing applied here to death, which tells you something about how the Norse understood the relationship between those things. The ship was set alight. It moved out from the shore and burned, and the gods stood on the land and watched it go. And the fire was visible from an enormous distance because Baldr was in it, and even in death, even in the fire. The brightness that had always surrounded him did not entirely leave. The light over Asgard was different after that. Not gone, not yet, but something that had been at the centre of it was missing. And the missing was not the kind that heals. Loki was still in Asgard, but the arrangement that had held for so long was not going to hold much longer. While the gods fought and mourned, people still woke up before dawn, mended nets, and prayed for good weather. That is also part of this story. Picture a fishing settlement somewhere on the Norwegian coast. In the time when these stories were alive, in the way that stories are alive, when they are the actual framework through which people understand the world they live in. The settlement is small, a cluster of wooden buildings close to the water, boats pulled up on the shore, nets hung to dry between posts, the smell of salt and wood smoke coming off everything. Before dawn, someone is already moving. They are checking the boats, looking at the sky, reading it. Not metaphorically, but literally. The way you read something that contains essential information about what is going to happen next and what you should do in response. The colour of the clouds at the horizon, the direction and feel of the wind, the behaviour of the birds that have spent more time over open water than any person has, and whose movements carry information that can be read if you know how to read it. The decision made by that person on that shore, in that cold hour before the light fully comes up, was not separate from the mythology. The thunder that rolled in from the sea was Thor working. The storm that came up fast was something with a name and a nature. Not simply weather, but a consequence of forces that the stories described. When someone on that shore called on Thor in a sudden squall, they were not performing an empty gesture towards something they did not believe in. They were engaging with a real relationship between the world they could see and the forces that the mythology told them were present in it. The Norse understanding of fate, which the sources described through the Norns and their weaving at the Well of Erd, was not a simple predetermination in which every event was fixed in advance and nothing could be changed. It was more like a web, a structure of interconnected outcomes in which individual choices and actions moved things within a framework that had certain fixed points. Some things were going to happen regardless, but within and around those fixed points, there was movement. There was the space in which you made your choices and carried your obligations, and faced what came at you with whatever quality you could bring to the facing. The Norns recorded what happened. They did not determine what you chose to do within what was happening. This distinction mattered in daily life in ways that were practical rather than philosophical. Oaths were the foundation of the social order in the world, the mythology described. Not as a formality or a convention, but as a binding force with real weight in the structure of how things worked. To break an oath was not simply a social failing. It was a disruption of something the cosmos itself took account of. The web of fate recorded what you had promised and what you had done with the promise. And the consequences of breaking what you had sworn moved through the web in ways that were not always immediately visible but were real and persistent. Tyr had placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth and lost it because someone had to make that pledge and mean it. The cost was real, the accounting was kept, and the people who told this story told it not as a cautionary tale about trusting wolves, but as a picture of what carrying an obligation looks like when the carrying is as costly as it gets. Hospitality carried similar weight. The surviving sources reflect a world in which the obligations of host and guest were serious and enforced by forces larger than any individual social pressure. A traveller welcomed under your roof carried protections that could not be casually set aside. The gods moved through Midgard in disguise. The sources tell us Odin appeared as an old man with a wide-brimmed hat and a staff and one eye, sitting at fires and asking questions and occasionally revealing himself as something other than a wandering old man. Depending on how he had been treated, you never quite knew who was at your door. The Valkyries moved through Midgard as well, choosing from among the fallen those who had come to Valhalla. For the warriors of Midgard, the Valkyries represented something specific about how certain kinds of death could be understood. To be chosen was to be recognized as someone whose death meant something in the larger accounting of the cosmos, someone whose fighting had been seen and found worthy of a particular continuation. Not every death was a Valkyrie's death. Most were not. Most people who died in the Norse world died of illness or age or accident, or the ordinary violence of a life lived in difficult conditions. And they went to hell, to the quiet realm below the world. The sources do not present this as a punishment. Going to hell was simply going where most people went. It was dim there, and still. A vast and quiet continuation, in Midgard itself. The mythology was present in smaller ways as well, woven into the landscape and the daily round. The land spirits, which the sources call Landvættir, were understood to inhabit specific places. The rocks, the rivers, the particular hills and trees and features of the places where people lived had presences in them that could be offended and could be honoured. And those presences were understood to matter in practical ways. When ships approached the coast of Iceland, the sources tell us there was a custom of removing the carved dragon heads from the prows before coming close to land. The dragon heads were right for open sea and for approaching an enemy shore. They were not right for the home coast, because the Landvættir who lived there should not be frightened by the faces of sea dragons coming at them. The custom was a small courtesy paid to beings most people never saw directly, but whose presence was assumed and whose comfort was worth a moment of consideration. This is the texture of daily life in Midgard as the surviving sources reflect it. Not a world divided cleanly between the sacred and the ordinary. A world in which the mythology was the everyday, in which the stories the culture told about gods and giants and the world, tree and the end of everything, were not separate from the questions of whether the harvest would come in or the storm would pass or the child would survive the winter. The people who built these stories were not simple. They were sophisticated enough to cross open ocean in wooden ships using stars and birds and the colour of the water. Sophisticated enough to produce the complex legal and poetic traditions that the surviving sources reflect. They knew what they knew, and what they also found it useful to live as though they knew was that the world was larger than what you could see directly, that the forces operating on daily life extended beyond what daily life could fully account for, and that the appropriate response to living inside something that large and that uncertain was to maintain your obligations. Honour what you had sworn. Treat the stranger at your door with the respect due to someone who might be more than they appeared, and face what came at you with as much steadiness as you could manage. The gods were doing the same thing. After all, in the great halls of Asgard, with their ravens and their chained wolf and their sun burning on a ship at sea, the gods were doing exactly the same thing, facing what was coming, keeping going, tending what could be tended, in the small hours before dawn, in the fishing settlement on the Norwegian coast. Someone was standing on the shore, making the calculation about whether today was a day the boats went out. The stars that Odin and his brothers had set in the heavens from Muspelheim's sparks were beginning to fade at the edges as the light came up. The day was forming itself out of the dark the way days always formed themselves, the way they had formed themselves since the first morning after Ask and Embla had opened their eyes. The cosmos held them without their knowing the full shape of what held them. The tree stood, and in its branches the eagle watched from above, and in its roots something chewed steadily in the dark, and 3 women poured water and white clay over wood that was slowly losing the long contest with what lived below it. And the web of fate recorded everything that was happening in all the worlds. Every small act and every large one. The death of a god on a burning ship, and the decision of a fisherman standing on a cold shore in the hour before sunrise, looking at the sky and trying to read what was there. Everything was connected. Everything had always been connected. Rest with that for a moment. Let the room settle around you. You have come a long way already tonight. From the void before everything, through the first killing and the making of the world, and the tree that holds it all together, and the god who paid everything he had for knowledge, and the god the farmers called on in storms, and the first war among the gods, and the figure who could not be categorized, and the death that changed the shape of everything that followed. There is more still to come, but not yet. For now, let the image of Midgard at night settle around you, the small fires, the boats on the dark water, the sky full of stars that were sparks from Muspelheim, arranged there by 3 brothers who had just made a world from a body and were trying, in their way, to make it feel like home. It was not a perfect world. It was never going to be permanent, but it was lit. What the gods did to Loki after Baldr's death tells you almost as much about them as it does about him. For a time after the funeral ship had burned and the light over Asgard had settled into something colder and less certain than it had been before, Loki remained among the gods. The sources do not give us a precise account of how long this period lasted or exactly what it looked like from day to day. What they give us is the sense of a changed atmosphere, an Asgard that knew what Loki had done and had not yet decided what to do about it, or perhaps had not yet found the moment when doing something about it became possible. The moment came at a feast. The sources describe a gathering at the hall of a figure named Aegir, a being associated with the sea, at which the gods were drinking and speaking with the particular ease of beings who are not, for the moment, being required to carry everything they usually carry. Loki came to this feast uninvited. He came anyway, and what happened there was the kind of thing that could not be walked back from. He moved through the hall with a precision that suggested he had thought about this, that he knew exactly what each figure present had done or failed to do that they would least want spoken aloud. And he spoke it. He accused the gods of cowardice. He made claims about the private lives of goddesses. He described failures and betrayals and acts of weakness that the hall would rather not have had recited in public. He moved from figure to figure with the focused energy of someone who has decided that the arrangement is over and that the way to mark the end of it is to say out loud what has never been said. This event is preserved in a poem called the Lokasenna, the flighting of Loki, and the exchanges go back and forth with considerable force. Gods respond. Loki responds to the responses. Whether all of what he says can be verified against other stories in the mythology is a question scholars approach carefully. What the poem makes clear is not whether Loki was right, but what happens when the figure who has always been at the edge of what the divine order could tolerate decides, all at once, to stop tolerating the divine order in return. Thor arrived at the feast and told Loki that he needed to leave, or the consequences would be immediate and significant. Loki left, but the gods now knew that whatever arrangement had existed was finished. Loki had made clear that he was no longer inside the structure that had contained him, and a figure like Loki outside the structure was a different proposition entirely from a figure like Loki inside it. They went after him. Loki had built himself a house in the mountains, in a place where 4 doors faced the 4 directions so that he could see anything approaching from any side. During the day he sometimes took the form of a salmon and lay still in a waterfall called Franang's Falls. In the churning water where the current would make him difficult to spot, he was thinking about nets. He was working through the problem of how a net would have to be constructed to catch a fish that understood how nets worked and would know how to avoid them. He was sitting in his house working through this problem when the gods appeared on the horizon, coming toward his mountain house with the particular purposefulness of beings who have made a decision and are now enacting it. Loki threw what he had been working on into the fire and ran for the waterfall. The gods found the ashes of his calculations, and they were not without intelligence. They looked at what the ash suggested, and they understood the shape of what Loki had been thinking about. They built a net from that understanding. They went to the waterfall and they cast it through the churning water. Loki felt the net and found the gap at the bottom, between the weights and the riverbed, and held still in the angle where the net could not quite reach. The gods felt the resistance and drew the net up, and he was not in it, but they knew something had been there. They tried again, weighting the bottom of the net more heavily so there was no gap between it and the riverbed. Loki swam upstream. He reached the waterfall itself and leaped over it. A salmon's jump, clear of the water and briefly visible in the air above the falls. Thor was waiting downstream. He caught Loki mid-air as the salmon came down from the jump, and the fish slipped and Thor tightened his grip. And this is why, the sources say, salmon taper toward the tail. Because of the grip applied to the last salmon that Loki became, they brought him back from the waterfall. They took him into a cave deep underground, a cave with 3 flat stones in it, each with a hole through it. They bound him to these stones, one under his shoulders, one under his hips, one under his knees, bound with what had been the entrails of one of his own sons. The sources name the son as Narfi, and they describe the entrails hardening into iron once the binding was complete, which tells you something about the nature of what was being used and the intention behind using it. Above him, they fastened a serpent to the ceiling of the cave so that its venom dripped down directly onto his face. This was the sentence the gods had determined for what Loki had done. Not death, not exile, something more particular than either. Something that would keep him present and aware and in continuous pain for all the time that remained before Ragnarok. The binding was designed to last until the end of the age, and it was designed to hurt for every moment of that duration. The venom dripped, and then someone came into the cave who had not been brought there by the gods or compelled by any force outside herself. Her name was Sigyn. She was Loki's wife, and she came into the cave, and she sat down beside him, and she held a bowl above his face to catch the venom before it reached him. The sources give her very little in the way of speech or extended description. She does not make a statement about why she is there or what her presence means or what she thinks about what her husband has done and what has been done to him in response. She sits. She holds the bowl. She catches what falls. When the bowl fills, she has to carry it out of the cave and empty it. And in the moment between the bowl being full and her returning with it empty, the venom reaches Loki's face. The sources describe what happens then in a way that has become one of the most striking images in all of Norse mythology. Loki's body convulses so violently in that moment that the earth shakes. This is what the Norse understood as the cause of earthquakes. somewhere below the world, in a cave with 3 stone slabs and a serpent on the ceiling, a bound figure flinches from drops of poison, and the ground moves above him. She comes back. She holds the bowl again. She catches what falls. There is a quality to this image that is genuinely difficult to account for fully. Sigyn is not a powerful figure in the Norse cosmos by any of the conventional measures. She appears rarely in the surviving sources. When she appears, it is almost always in connection with Loki. And the connection is not one that the stories tend to present as straightforward. Because Loki is not straightforward, and choosing to stay beside him is not a simple thing to do or to be. In the stories that survive, what Sigyn does in that cave can be read as a picture of loyalty that has separated itself entirely from the question of judgment. She is not there because she has concluded that Loki was right in what he did. She is not there because she believes she can change what is happening or prevent what is coming. She cannot. The binding will hold until Ragnarok, and then it will not. And what Loki does when it does not hold is something the sources have already told us. She is there because she is there. Because the bowl is needed and she has it, and she is sitting in a cave below the world catching poison so that the person beside her does not have to receive all of it. Quiet, tragic, and genuinely difficult to place within any simple moral framework, which is perhaps why this image has stayed so present in the sources despite Sigyn's small role in the larger narrative. It does not resolve into a lesson. It does not tell you that what she is doing is right, or wrong, or wise, or foolish. It simply shows you someone making a choice in conditions of absolute difficulty and sitting with that choice. Bowl in hand. In the dark. The earthquakes continue. The Norse understood. Below the world. The cause of them is ongoing. A bound figure and a held bowl. And the moment when the bowl fills and must be emptied and the venom comes through before she can return. Outside the cave, the worlds continued. The farmers worked and the fishermen watched the sky and the warriors trained and the dead went to Valhalla or to Hell, depending on how the dying happened. The serpent around the world lay in its deep ocean. The wolf on his island grew in his binding. Nidhogg chewed at the root of the world tree with the consistency it had always brought to that work. And in the cave, the bowl filled, and the earth shook, and Sigyn came back, and the dripping resumed, and the age moved forward toward its end. Loki lay there through it all. The sources do not tell us what he thought about during those ages below the world. What they tell us is what happened when the time came, when Ragnarok arrived and the binding broke, and he came up out of the cave into the open air. He did not stand with the gods he had lived among for so long. He sailed to Ragnarok at the helm of a ship made of the fingernails and toenails of the dead, sailing with the forces arrayed against Asgard, carrying the things that had been building toward this moment since before the world was made. Whether the cave changed him, or whether the cave simply removed the structure that had kept him in a particular role, is a question the sources leave entirely open. He was what he was in the cave, and he was what he was at Ragnarok, and the relationship between those two things is left to whoever is listening to work out for themselves. In the cave, the bowl filled again. Sigyn carried it to the entrance and emptied it and came back. The dripping resumed. The earth, far above them, was still. The most powerful weapons in Norse mythology were not made by gods. They were commissioned. This is one of those details that shifts something in how you understand the Norse cosmos when you sit with it carefully. The beings at the top of the divine hierarchy, the figures who held the fate of the worlds in their decisions, and whose conflicts would determine the shape of everything right up to and including the end, were dependent for their most essential tools on beings who occupied a very different position in the order of things. The dwarves of the Norse cosmos worked underground, in forges lit by fire in the deep places of the world, in the realm the sources call Svartalfheim, or in some accounts Nidavellir, and their relationship to the surface world was one of negotiation rather than deference. The gods could not simply command what the dwarves made. They had to arrange for it, to pay for it, to create situations in which the dwarves would produce what was needed. And what the dwarves made was, in almost every case, the thing that allowed the gods to be what they were. Consider what it took to make Mjolnir. It began with a moment of pointless mischief. as several things involving Loki tend to begin, he crept into the chambers where Sif slept, the golden-haired wife of Thor, and he cut her hair, all of it, close to her head. He left her shorn and sleeping, and he was elsewhere when she woke and found what had happened. The sources do not offer an extended explanation for why he did this. It happened with a quality that runs through many of Loki's actions, a purposelessness that managed to produce very specific consequences, Thor found out. The conversation that followed was direct in the way that Thor's conversations about serious matters tended to be direct. The hair would be replaced. Real hair. Golden hair that would grow as natural hair grows. And Loki would be the one to arrange this, or the consequences would be immediate and significant. Loki went underground. He went to a pair of craftsmen known as the Sons of Ivaldi, makers whose skill the sources describe as being without equal. He commissioned 3 objects: new hair for Sif, made of real gold, that would grow naturally once placed on her head, the ship Skidbladnir for Freya, large enough to carry all the gods with their weapons and armour when fully deployed, but able to be folded to fit in a pouch when not needed, the spear Gungnir for Odin, a spear that never missed its mark. The Sons of Ivaldi produced all 3 without apparent difficulty. The hair was perfect. The ship was perfect. The spear was perfect. A reasonable being in Loki's position would have returned to Asgard with the gifts and considered the matter resolved. Loki made a bet instead. He went to another dwarf, a figure named Brock, and wagered his own head against Brock's skill. The wager was that Brock and his brother Sindri could not produce 3 objects equal in quality to what the Sons of Ivaldi had made. Brock accepted. What happened in Sindri's forge is worth dwelling in for a moment, because it is one of the most specific and tactile scenes in the surviving sources, and because what it produced was the object that would matter most in the daily life of every person in Midgard who called on Thor in a storm or at a threshold moment. Sindri placed a pigskin in the forge and told Brock to work the bellows and not to stop for any reason until he returned. Brock worked the bellows steadily. Something settled on his hand and bit him. He kept working. Sindri returned and pulled from the forge a golden boar, its bristles shining so brightly that it could light any darkness wherever it ran. The boar would be Freya's, a companion made from firelight and a dwarf's discipline. Sindri placed gold in the forge. Brock worked the bellows again. Steady as before, something settled on him and bit harder. He kept working. Sindri returned and pulled from the forge the ring Draupnir, a gold ring that would produce 8 rings of equal weight every 9 nights. Endless multiplication in the dark, a ring that gave more than it received. Made in a forge below the world by beings who understood that certain kinds of value come from places that those who live above can never reach. This ring would go to Odin. He would place it on Baldr's funeral pyre when the time came. Baldr would send it back from hell as the only thing he could send. Proof that something of the old world could pass through the ending and return. Sindri placed iron in the forge. He told Brock to work the bellows and absolutely not to stop, with an emphasis that suggested this 3rd object was the most critical. Brock worked steadily. This time, what settled on him went for his eyelid, biting hard enough that blood ran down into his eye. He stopped for just a moment, just long enough to knock the creature away. Before resuming, Sindri returned and pulled from the forge a hammer. The hammer was Mjolnir. It was perfect in every respect except one. The handle was slightly shorter than it should have been, because Brock had stopped working the bellows for the moment it took to deal with what had been biting his eyelid, and the creature that had been biting him, first his hand during the boar, then his arm during the ring, then his eyelid during the hammer, was Loki, in the shape of a fly, doing exactly what Loki always did, finding the one intervention that would change the outcome, inserting himself into a process he had set in motion to ensure the result was not quite what it could have been. When the objects were presented to the gods and the quality of the work was judged, the verdict was that Mjolnir won. The short handle did not diminish what the hammer was. Brock won the bet. Loki's head was forfeit. Loki pointed out that the bet had specified his head but said nothing about his neck. He would not consent to any method of taking his head that involved harming his neck. This was exactly the kind of argument Loki was capable of making, and that was, technically, unanswerable. Brock could not take the head without the neck. What Brock did instead was sew Loki's lips shut with an awl. Loki eventually worked the stitching free. He always found the way out of the immediate situation. Now picture what the gods possessed because of what the dwarves had made in those underground forges. Gungnir never missed its mark. Odin would carry it to Ragnarok, would hold it in his hand on the last day of the age. The spear forged underground by beings who worked by firelight in the depths of the world, passing upward into the hand of the god who sat on the highest seat in the cosmos. Skidbladnir could carry all the gods at full sail and fold to fit in a pocket when the sailing was done. The ship that could hold everything and become nothing. Made in a forge below the world. Draupnir multiplied in the dark. Wealth that produced more wealth. Passed through the fire on Baldr's pyre and returned from hell. Still dripping, and Mjolnir returned to the hand that threw it. Every time. But more than that, it consecrated. The same hammer that killed giants was the hammer invoked at weddings and births and deaths. The weapon of the boundary becoming the instrument of the hearth. The dwarves had made the object that meant most in the daily life of every person who called on Thor in a storm. And they had made it slightly imperfect because Loki had been there in the shape of a fly. The most important things in the Norse cosmos came from below. They came from beings who worked underground, who were not part of the divine order in Asgard, but who made the divine order in Asgard possible. The gods who ruled from above could not make alone what was required to hold the cosmos together. The binding Gleipnir that held Fenrir on his island, the ribbon made from things that do not exist, came from the dwarves. The reasoning was precise. Something that does not exist cannot be overcome by anything that does exist. Fenrir could not break it because there was nothing in him that corresponded to what it was made from. The most dangerous being in the Norse cosmos was held by a ribbon, and the ribbon was the most extraordinary thing the dwarves had ever made. Jormungandr lay in the deep ocean, its body encircling Midgard, its tail in its own mouth. Thor had encountered it before Ragnarok, in fishing stories and in the journey to Utgard. Each encounter a preview of the one that would resolve their relationship permanently. In one account, Thor pulled the serpent almost to the surface on a fishing line, and the two forces that were going to meet at Ragnarok looked at each other across the water before the moment broke. They had felt the full weight of what they were to each other. The final meeting was reserved for the last day, Helsat in Niflheim, receiving the dead in the continuous stream that had flowed since the first people had died. All the ordinary deaths that were not the kind that went to Valhalla, and she kept them in the quiet of her realm. Baldr was there now, seated at the place of honour at her table, waiting for the thing that would allow him to return. The dwarves worked in their forges below the world. The bound things waited in the places they had been bound. The weapons waited in the hands of the gods who carried them. The winter that would announce the end was still ahead. But the preparations, on all sides, had been underway for a very long time. The end of the world did not begin with fire. It began with weather. This is not the way most people imagine apocalypse. The images that tend to come to mind when that word is used run toward the sudden and the overwhelming. Fire falling from the sky. The ground opening, some force arriving with a noise that cannot be ignored or misunderstood. The Norse end of everything began with none of those things. It began quietly, in the way that the most serious changes often begin, with something that at first might have seemed like a bad season. The winter came. It was called Fimbulwinter in the sources, a word that carries in Old Norse a sense of something like mighty winter or tremendous winter. A winter so far beyond the ordinary scale of winters that it needed a different category of name entirely. And what made Fimbulwinter different from an ordinary winter, even an extraordinarily severe one, was not simply how cold it was or how much snow fell. It was its duration. 3 winters came, one after another, with no summer in between. Think about what that means in practical terms for people living close to the northern edge of what human settlement could sustain. A single hard winter in the Norse world was serious. Food stored from the previous harvest had to be managed carefully. The margin between surviving and not surviving in a bad winter was narrow enough that it required discipline and planning, and the kind of attention to resources that left little room for error. 2 hard winters with no summer between them would mean planting that could not happen, harvests that would not come in, animals that would die when the fodder ran out, stored food that had to be stretched across a span it had never been calculated to cover. 3 winters, continuous, with no summer at all, meant the progressive failure of everything that ordinary life depended on. Not just food, though food would fail. Not just animals, though the animals would die. It meant the failure of the social structures that depended on the rhythms of the seasons, the cycle of planting and harvest, and the particular activities organised around each part of the year that held communities together and confirmed the arrangements that made settlement possible. The sources describe what happened to human society during Fimbulwinter with a specificity that shows these were not simply dramatic details added for effect. Brothers would kill each other. The word the texts use carries precision, not strangers, not enemies in the ordinary sense, but brothers, the people bound by the closest ties the Norse world recognized, the ties of blood and shared life and mutual obligation that stood at the foundation of everything else. When those ties broke, when the cold and the hunger and the endless dark pressed people past the point where the obligations of kinship held, the social world collapsed from the inside. Sons would not spare fathers. The vertical bonds between generations, as fundamental to the Norse order as the horizontal bonds between siblings, would dissolve under the pressure of 3 winters with nothing between them. Not because the people were evil, not because some corruption had entered them from outside, because the conditions that allowed those bonds to be honoured had been removed, season by season, winter by winter, until there was nothing left to sustain the behaviour that the bonds required. This is a particular and precise vision of how endings work, not a sudden catastrophe from outside that overwhelms a society still intact, a slow erosion from within, a stripping away of the conditions that made ordinary things possible, until what is left are people in impossible conditions, doing what people in impossible conditions sometimes do to each other. The sun was dimming during Fimbulwinter. The light was failing, not all at once but gradually, the sky carrying a quality different from ordinary winter sky, a darkness that was not simply the absence of summer light, but something more fundamental. The wolves that had been chasing Sol and Mani across the sky since the world was made were gaining on them now. Skoll was closing the distance to the sun chariot. Hati was closing the distance to the moon. The sky that had always held its 2 great lights was becoming a sky where those lights were failing to hold their ground. Stars were falling. The sources tell us, during Fimbulwinter, the sparks from Muspelheim that Odin and his brothers had arranged in the heavens on the day the world was made, set in their places to mark time and direction for everything that lived below them, were beginning to leave their positions. The architecture of the sky, which had been stable for as long as the world had existed, was coming apart in ways that any observer of the heavens would have understood as something different from ordinary celestial movement. In the bound places of the cosmos, things were stirring. Fenrir, on his island, with Gleipnir around him and the sword propped in his open jaws, had been still for all the ages since Tyr had placed his hand in the wolf's mouth and lost it. The ribbon made from things that do not exist had held through all that time. But what holds does not hold forever in a cosmos that was made from a killing and is moving toward a burning. The earth had been shaking more frequently. The earthquakes that came from the cave where Loki lay in his binding growing more persistent, as though the ground itself was responding to the approach of something that had been announced at the beginning, but had not yet arrived. In the ocean, Jormungandr was moving. The world serpent that had lain in the cold water at the edge of everything, its body encircling Midgard, was beginning to shift its enormous coils. The ocean rises when the serpent moves. The floods that had been building at the coasts of Midgard were telling the people who lived close to the water that something below the surface they had always lived beside was no longer lying still. Naglfar was nearly complete, the ship that would carry the forces opposed to Asgard at Ragnarok, made of the fingernails and toenails of the dead, had been under construction since the first people had died, accumulating its material one death at a time over all the ages of the world. The sources include an observation about this that carries its own particular weight, people should cut the nails of the dead carefully, because every nail left uncut contributes to Naglfar, and the faster Naglfar is completed, the sooner it sails. And the sooner it sails, the sooner what it carries arrives. The ship of the ending of everything was connected to the small domestic rituals of caring for the dead, built from what was left unattended in those final moments. During Fimbulwinter, the deaths were many. The ship was nearing completion. In Asgard, the gods understood what the signs meant. Odin's ravens brought news from every direction, and none of it suggested that what was coming could be redirected. The warriors in Valhalla trained with the particular urgency of beings who know that the preparation is reaching its end. The great rooster Gullinkambi, who lived in Valhalla and whose crowing was destined to wake the warriors at Ragnarok, shifted on his perch. In other realms, other roosters crowed with the quality the sources associate with that final signal. Heimdall stood at his post at the top of Bifrost, the burning bridge between Asgard and the lower worlds. His senses, described in the sources as so acute that he could hear grass growing and wool growing on the backs of sheep, had always been oriented outward, watching for what was coming. The horn he carried, Gjalhorn, had been given to him at the beginning of his watch and kept near one of the roots of Yggdrasil, saved for the moment when it would be needed. He had never needed it before. That was changing. Fimbulwinter was not simply a catastrophic series of seasons. It was the transition between the world as it had been and the world as it was about to become, the gods running out of the time they had been given, the wolf's chain approaching the end of what it could hold, the ocean running out of patience with what lay in it. The end did not arrive with a shout. It arrived the way all the most serious changes arrive, with the slow accumulation of signs that something was different. Something was failing. Something that had held for a very long time was no longer going to hold. The last star fell. The wolf found the sun. Every figure who walked onto that field knew they would not walk off it. They came anyway. This is what gives Ragnarok a different emotional shape from many great mythic battles. It is not a conflict where the outcome is uncertain. It is not a story where courage and skill might tip the scales toward the side that deserves to win. Every god who assembled for Ragnarok knew what was going to happen. They had known for a long time. Odin had drunk from Mimir's well and hung from Yggdrasil for 9 nights and sent his ravens out every morning for uncountable ages. And what all of that knowledge added up to was a clear and complete picture of exactly how this day would go. They came anyway. The beginning of Ragnarok in the sources is not a single moment. It is the convergence of several things happening at the same time, each one the fulfillment of what had been building since before the world was made, each one arriving together because the age had run its course and the structures that had held the various dangers in place had reached the end of what they could hold. Fenrir broke free, Gleipnir gave way. The sources do not describe the breaking in extended detail. They tell us that Fenrir was loose, and the scale of what that meant was immediately visible. His upper jaw reached to the sky. His lower jaw dragged along the ground. Fire burned from his eyes and from his nostrils. He moved with his mouth open in that configuration, consuming everything in his path. The sky above him scraped by his upper jaw as he ran. In the ocean, Jormungandr rose. The world serpent released its own tail and came up out of the deep water in a movement that displaced the ocean itself. The flooding that had been building during Fimbulwinter became the full reality of the serpent rising. The ocean poured over the land. Midgard, the protected middle world that had been the home of human life for all the ages of the world, was submerged. Naglfar launched, the ship of fingernails and toenails, completed at last, moved out from Niflheim into the flooding waters. Loki was at the helm. He had come up from the cave where Sigyn had sat beside him through all the ages of his binding, and he had chosen where to stand in the final accounting, and he stood at the helm of Naglfar, with the choice made and the course set toward Asgard. From Muspelheim, Surt came. He had been there since before Ymir, since before the void had been anything but a void. He came now from the south with his flaming sword, and the sources describe his sword as brighter than the sun, which by this point in Ragnarok made a particular kind of sense. Because Skoll had caught Sol and Hati had caught Mani, and the sky had gone dark in the way the sources had always said it would. The wolves that had been chasing the sun and moon across the sky since the world was made had finally closed the distance that had always been shrinking. The sky was dark. Heimdall raised Gjalhorn to his lips and blew. The sound went through all the 9 worlds. Every being in every realm heard it and understood what it meant. The warriors of Valhalla woke. Odin armed himself. He took Gungnir, the spear the sons of Ivaldi had made in their underground forge, and he rode out from Asgard on Sleipnir. The 8-legged horse born from Loki's transformation in the early days of the world. The gods assembled. The warriors of Valhalla formed up behind them. They marched to the field the sources call Vigrid, an enormous plain extending in every direction further than the eye could measure, large enough for what was coming. What followed on that field was not a battle in the sense of 2 forces meeting with the outcome in genuine doubt. It was a series of fated encounters. Each one, the resolution of a relationship that had been building since the earliest ages of the world. Each death on that field was the completion of something. Each loss was the arrival of what had always been coming for that particular figure. Odin and Fenrir meet. The wolf who had grown in his binding through all the ages, whose jaws could span the distance between earth and sky, came at Odin on the field of Vigrid. The sources do not dwell on the fighting itself. They tell us the outcome. Fenrir swallowed Odin, the All-Father, the god who had sacrificed his eye and hung himself on the world tree for 9 nights and learned everything it was possible to learn about what was coming, was swallowed by the wolf. The knowledge had not saved him. The preparation had not saved him. The warriors of Valhalla did not save him. He had known this would happen, and it happened. And the knowing had not made it not happen. Odin had a son named Vidar. He came to where Fenrir stood with Odin swallowed, and he killed the wolf. He placed his foot on the wolf's lower jaw, pressing it down, and he seized the upper jaw and tore Fenrir apart. The sources give significance to Vidar's boot, suggesting it had been made over the long ages from leather scraps that cobblers had trimmed away from shoes, accumulated across all the generations of the world, ready when the moment came. The boot that killed the wolf had been being made since the first person cut leather. Fenrir was dead. Odin was dead. Vidar stood on the field of Vigrid. Thor and Jormungandr met. They had met before, in the fishing stories and in Utgard. Each previous encounter a preview of the one that would resolve their relationship permanently. Thor killed the world serpent. The sources describe it as a decisive killing. Mjolnir swung with the full force that had always been in him. The hammer with the handle slightly shorter than it should have been. Swung by the god who had spent all the ages of the world standing at whatever boundary needed standing at. The serpent died, and then Thor walked 9 steps. The venom of Jormungandr entered him with the killing blow and moved through him at the pace that it moved. And Thor walked 9 steps away from the body of the serpent, and on the 9th step he fell. The sources count the steps. 9 nights on the tree for Odin. 9 worlds in the Norse cosmos. 9 steps between the killing of the world serpent and the death of the god who killed it. He had known this was how it would go. He had walked his 9 steps and fallen. Freyr and Surt met. This death carries the particular quality of a long consequence arriving. Freyr had given away his sword. He had given it to his servant Skirnir in the days before Ragnarok, in the early part of a story preserved in a poem called Skirnismal in the Poetic Edda. He had seen a woman named Gerd from the high seat Hilidskalf, a seat that was not his to use, and he had sent Skirnir to win her for him. Skirnir asked for a price, and the price he asked for was Freya's sword, the sword that could fight on its own, that could swing itself against enemies without a hand to guide it. Freya gave it away. He fought Surt at Ragnarok with an antler. The ancient fire, being from Muspelheim, carrying a sword brighter than the absent sun, was met by the god of sunshine and good harvests with an antler in his hand, can be read in this, and the sources seem to invite the reading without insisting on it. Something about the price of choosing, in a world where choices have consequences that outlast the moment of choosing. Freyr had chosen what he wanted more than the sword. He had made that choice long before Ragnarok, when Ragnarok was still the future. And the future always arrives eventually. Surt killed him. Turin Garm met. Garm, the great hound who guarded the entrance to Hel, whose chest was bloody and who had bayed at Odin when Odin rode down to wake the dead Cirrus, broke free at Ragnarok as all the bound things broke free. Tyr, who had placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth and lost it so that the binding could proceed, met Garm on the field of Vigrid. They killed each other, the god of law and the guardian of the dead, each one paying the final cost of what they had been. Loki and Heimdall met. These two had been connected in ways the sources preserve in fragments that do not fully cohere into a single clear history, a rivalry or an enmity that predated the specific events of Ragnarok. Heimdall, who had watched all the worlds from his post at the top of Bifrost through all the ages, who had seen everything and heard everything and blown the horn that woke the last army. And Loki, who had moved between forms and categories and sides through those same ages, who had been the figure the mythology needed and could not contain. They killed each other on the field of Vigrid. When the fighting had run its course, Surt moved across the field. He carried his sword. Brighter than the absent sun, he swept it across the world, and the fire came. Not just the fire on the battlefield, but the fire the mythology had been pointing toward since Muspelheim had existed on one side of the void, and everything implicit in that configuration had been waiting. The fire moved across the world and burned what remained to burn. The sky that had been made from a giant's skull went dark. The seas that had been made from a giant's blood rose over the land. The mountains made from his bones disappeared beneath the water. The stars made from Muspelheim's sparks had already fallen. The surviving sources are not entirely consistent about the exact fate of Yggdrasil in this fire. The cosmos the tree had held together was consumed. What precisely happened to the tree itself, the sources handled differently across different texts. And scholars who work with this material note that the accounts do not all say the same thing. What can be said is that the fire of Surt reached the world that Yggdrasil had sustained. The field of Vigrid was still. The fire burned what the fire burned. And in the silence after the burning, in the space where the Norse cosmos had been, something was already beginning that had been described in the sources all along, present but not yet arrived, waiting at the far edge of what Ragnarok meant for those who knew how to read it all the way to its end. The world was not finished. It was between breaths. The Norse cosmos did not end with ash. It surfaced. This is the part of the story that gets left out most often. In the abbreviated versions and the popular retellings that treat Ragnarok as a finale rather than as what the surviving sources actually describe it as being. In those shortened accounts, Ragnarok is the end. The gods die, the world burns, the ocean rises, everything that existed is consumed. A mythology of magnificent and unflinching doom, admirable in its refusal of easy comfort, but still a story that closes in darkness. The sources do not close in darkness. After the fire, after the ocean, after the sky went dark and the ground sank into the sea, something came up from below the surface of the water, slowly, the way that things emerge from the deep when the conditions for them have been prepared over a very long time. The surviving sources describe it in a passage of extraordinary quietness, a passage that follows the tremendous noise of Ragnarok, the way that silence follows any sound that has been total enough to exhaust itself. The earth rose again out of the water, green, not rebuilt, not restored to what it had been before the burning, not a reconstruction of the world that Odin and his brothers had assembled from Ymir's body on the first day of everything. Something new, something that had been waiting in the possibility of what comes after, the way that what grows after a fire is not the same as what burned, but something that uses the ash and the cleared ground to become something that could not have grown when the old growth was still standing. The earth that surfaced was green because it was already growing. The surviving texts describe waterfalls running, eagles flying, fish in the rivers. The description gives you the sensory texture of this new world in terms that are deliberately ordinary, deliberately small, scale, after the enormous scale of what had just happened. Not grand statements about the new cosmic order, just water falling and birds moving and fish swimming in clear water over a green and living ground. Unsown fields would bear crops. The poetic Edda tells us the earth would produce without being planted, without the labour that the old world had required of the people who lived in it. This detail is small in the telling and significant in what it implies. The new world would not begin with scarcity, with the hard work of clearing ground and hoping the weather would cooperate long enough for something to grow. It would begin with abundance, with the ground already doing what the ground in the old world had to be persuaded to do through careful attention and seasonal labour. Some of the gods survived, not all. The sources are clear about the deaths at Ragnarok, and those deaths were real and final. Odin was gone, Thor was gone, Freyr was gone, Tyr was gone, Heimdall was gone, Loki was gone. The figures who had defined the Norse pantheon through all the ages of the world had played out their fated roles on the field of Vigrid, but others remained. Beda, who had killed Fenrir after the wolf swallowed Odin, survived into the new world. Vali survived. Modi and Mangi, the sons of Thor, survived, and they carried Mjolnir between them into the world that came after their father's death. The hammer that had consecrated weddings and births and deaths and had killed more giants than any other object in the Norse cosmos passed from the hands of the father to the hands of the sons. It went forward into the new world, still slightly short in the handle, still capable of what it had always been capable of. Honir survived, the same Honir who had been sent to the Vanir as a hostage after the Aesir-Vanir War. The figure who could not make decisions without Mimir beside him, appeared in the new world in the surviving sources in a role connected to divination and to the reading of what the new world contained. Whatever Honir had been in the old world, something in him was carried forward into what came after, and Baldr came back. This is the moment in the account of the new world that changes the emotional weight of everything that has happened in tonight's story. Baldr, the brightest thing in Norse mythology, the god whose death had been the point of no return, the figure whose falling had marked the moment when everything still to come became inevitable, came back from hell. He and his brother Hodra, the blind god whose hand had thrown the mistletoe at Loki's guidance, returned together from the realm of the dead. The sources describe them coming to the green earth that had surfaced from the water, and sitting together in the place where the great battle had been fought, and talking about what had been, and about the things that the world had contained when it was the world they had known, they would find in the grass. The sources tell us, the golden game pieces, the pieces that the Aesir had played with in the early days of the world, lying where they had been left in the grass all those ages ago, when the games had stopped and the more serious events of the mythology had taken over. They would pick them up and look at them and remember. That image requires a moment. The gods of a world that has burned, sitting in the new green grass, finding the pieces of old games that had been played before everything went wrong, holding them in their hands and talking about what had been, not with grief that paralyzes, not with the crushing weight of having survived something that destroyed almost everyone and everything they had known, with the particular quality of beings who have come through the other side of the thing they were always moving toward, and who are now in the place that comes after, picking up what remains and beginning to understand what the new world contains. Hodra's presence alongside Baldr matters here. He was the instrument of Baldr's death, the blind god whose hand Loki had guided, whose throw had sent the mistletoe into the brightest figure in the old world and started the sequence that led through everything that followed. He came back from hell alongside his brother. The sources present this without extended moral commentary. Both were there, in the new green grass, with the old game pieces between them. What does it mean that Hodra came back with Baldr? The sources do not fully explain. They present it as a fact of the new world and leave the weight of it open. One reading, and the sources seem to invite readings without insisting on particular conclusions, is that the new world was not built on the settlements of the old world's grievances, that the fire had cleared something along with everything else it had cleared. 2 human beings survived Ragnarok, their names in the Vafthrudnismal, one of the poems of the Poetic Edda. are given as Lif and Lifthrasir. Lif means something close to life in Old Norse. Lifthrasir carries meanings that scholars have interpreted variously, with suggestions including something like striving after life or eager for life. They had hidden in a place the sources call Hodmimir's Wood, and the fire of Surt had not reached them there. They had survived on the morning dew, the sources say. And from these two, the new human population of the new world would grow. This detail comes specifically from the Vafthrûd Nismal, in the context of a wisdom contest between Odin and the giant Vafthrûdnir, in which Odin asks what the giant knows about what comes after the end of the world. As with everything in the surviving Norse sources, the detail is filtered through a particular text and a particular context, and scholars note that not all sources handle this material the same way. What can be said is the essential shape two human beings survived, hidden in a place the fire could not reach, and from them the new world's human life would begin. The new sun rose over the new world. Before Skoll caught Sol, before the wolf swallowed the sun and the sky went dark over Vigrid, Sol had given birth to a daughter. This daughter rode out after Ragnarok into the new sky, pulling light across the new world the way her mother had pulled it across the old one, without the wolf behind her. In the old world, the sun moved fast because it was being chased. Every day that light crossed the sky, it crossed at the speed of something running from something gaining on it. The brightness and the warmth and the cycles of the day that organized human life and growing things were not the movement of a power at rest. They were the movement of a power in flight. In the new world, the sun moved because it moved, not because a wolf was getting closer, not because the distance between the chaser and the chased was shrinking with every circuit, just the light, in the new sky, over the new green earth, moving at its own pace. Think about what that changes in the quality of the light. In the old world, every sunrise contained within it the knowledge, available to anyone who understood the mythology, that the sun making this crossing was a little less safe than it had been the morning before. That Skoll was a little closer, that the wolves would eventually catch what they were chasing, and that eventually was always moving toward now. The light of the old world was light on borrowed time, and the people who built the mythology knew that and kept that knowledge present in the stories they told. In the new world, the light was not borrowed. The new gods who gathered on the surfacing earth were beginning from the ash and the water, rather than from the elaborate inherited structure of the old cosmic order. Vida and Vali, Modi and Mangi, Onir, Baldr and Hodra. These were not a continuation of the old Asgard. They were the starting point of something that the sources do not describe in full detail, because the surviving texts bring you to the beginning of the new world and let that be where the account rests. It gets you to the green earth and the returning gods, and the old game pieces in the new grass and the sun moving without a wolf behind it. And then it allows that to be enough, because it is enough. Ragnarok was not a defeat. It was not the losing of a battle that should have been won, but was not. It was the completion of what the cosmos had always been moving toward. The resolution of the tension that had been built into the structure of everything since two forces met in a void that had no edges and produced a being that no one had intended. The world had been made from a killing, and it had moved, through all its ages, toward the moment when the logic of that origin would play out to its conclusion. What came after was not a reward for having endured the ending. It simply was. The way the void had simply been before anything existed in it. The new world arrived because that is what comes after endings in a cosmos that was never designed to run in only one direction. Something at the center of the new cosmos connected what was above to what is below, connected the old game pieces in the new grass to the hands that would pick them up and begin again, whether it was the same tree that had always stood at the center, in some form that the fire had not fully extinguished, or something new that grew from the ash of what the old tree had been. The sources handle this with the same openness they bring to many things at the edges of what the mythology can fully describe. They give you the presence of something at the center of the new world that serves the purpose the tree had always served. They let the question remain open. Both possibilities say something true. If it is the same tree, then the gnawing from below and the weight of all the ages and the fire that came from the south were not. In the end, enough to extinguish what had always been growing. The tree that was always dying was also always living, and the living persisted through everything that came for it. To the other side, if it is something new, then what grew in the ash of the old tree is evidence that the capacity to produce worlds was not located in any particular arrangement of beings and structures that the fire could destroy. It was located in something more fundamental, something that the fire could burn the expression of but not the source of, something that would grow again from the ash because growing is what it does. Either way, the fields are growing. Either way, the light moves across the new sky without anything behind it. The game pieces are in the grass. The gods who remain are picking them up. Something is beginning. Odin knew Fenrir would swallow him. He gathered his army and rode to Vigrid. Thor knew the venom of the world's serpent would kill him after 9 steps. He swung Mjolnir and walked his 9 steps and fell. Tyr knew the gods were not going to honour the pledge when he placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth. He placed it anyway because someone had to, and he was the one who stepped forward. These are not stories about characters who found a way around what was coming. They are something else. They are instructions for how to carry yourself when the outcome is already decided. That is a distinction worth holding carefully, because it changes what the mythology was for. Ragnarok is not a warning. It is not a description of what will happen if the gods fail to be virtuous enough. It is a description of what is going to happen. It was woven into the structure of the cosmos from before the world was made. The Norns recorded it because it was what was there to record. The world was made from a killing, and it would end in a burning, and between those two events, the question was never whether any of it could be avoided. The question was always how you carried yourself inside it. In the stories that survive, what you find running through all of them is a consistent answer to that question. Not a triumphant answer, not a comfortable one, but a real one. Freyr knew what Ragnarok would demand of him. He had given his sword away for reasons that had nothing to do with Ragnarok. And when Ragnarok came, he faced it without the sword he no longer had. He faced it with full knowledge of what that meant for how his part of the day would end. Can be read in his death. And the sources seem to invite the reading without insisting on it. Something about the nature of choice in a world where choices have consequences that outlast the moment of choosing. He had chosen what he wanted more than the sword. The cost arrived when it arrived. The Norns poured white clay and water over the roots of a tree they knew was going to face the fire of Surt. They did not appear, in the sources, to be doing this because they believed it would save the tree forever. They appeared to be doing it because it was what there was to do. Sigyn held a bowl in a cave below the world, catching what fell, because the bowl was needed and she had it, quietly, in the dark, with no audience and no outcome she could change. None of these figures could redirect the arc of what was coming. What they were doing was something else. Something the Norse sources return to again and again with a consistency that suggests it was not accidental. They were present to what they were doing. They were carrying what they could carry. They were being, in the specific conditions of the specific moment they were in, as fully themselves as the situation allowed. One answer preserved in these stories, running through the poetry and the legal traditions and the saga culture that grew up around them, is that what matters is not whether the outcome is good, but how you carry yourself when the outcome is bad. The interest of the sources, across the many different kinds of texts that survive, is not in whether things work out. It is in how a figure faces the moment when they do not. The traces of this orientation in the material that survives are real and specific, though care is needed in how broadly they are read across what was not a single unified culture, but a range of related peoples across Scandinavia and Iceland, and the regions they settled over several centuries. The poetry that survives shows a consistent interest in how figures responded to extreme difficulty, in the specific quality of how someone faced a death or a loss or a defeat. The interest is not in whether the outcome was bad. The interest is in how the figure carried themselves when the outcome was bad. The sagas, those long prose narratives written down in Iceland, mostly in the 13th and 14th centuries, but preserving traditions considerably older than their written form, return repeatedly to characters whose defining quality is how they behave when things go against them, not characters who avoid bad situations through wisdom or luck. characters who are in bad situations and face them with a quality of steadiness that the culture clearly valued, because it recorded that steadiness in story after story across generations. The ceremonial life of the people who built the mythology reflects something similar. The rituals that marked the important thresholds of a Norse life were not only petition, not only asking a divine authority to produce a better outcome, they were also acknowledgement that a threshold was being crossed, acknowledgement that the forces governing life and death were real and present, a marking of the moment, a bringing of what was ordinary into contact with what the stories described, a way of saying that this thing happening now is happening inside the cosmos. The stories describe, and the cosmos the stories describe is one in which things of value exist, even though they are not permanent. When Thor's hammer was invoked at a wedding, it was that, not a guarantee, a marking, a way of saying this matters. In a universe that does not promise that mattering will protect you, what the Norse mythological tradition offers, across all the different forms it took and all the different hands it passed through, is not comfort in the usual sense. It is something rarer than comfort. It is the company of figures who faced clearly what they were facing and kept going anyway. Not because keeping going would change the outcome, because stopping would mean something worse than whatever was at the end of the road. Odin knew what was coming and he sent the ravens out anyway. The bowl was needed and Sigyn held it. The tree was being eaten from below and it stood. Much of how we understand tonight's story was shaped by one man in 13th century Iceland. That matters more than most people realise. His name was Snorri Sturluson. He was born in 1179, into a family of political and literary standing and a society that took both with great seriousness. He became one of the most powerful men in Iceland during his lifetime. A chieftain and a law speaker, involved in the complicated and sometimes violent politics of 13th century Icelandic society. He was also, by any measure, one of the most important writers of the medieval Norse world, and what he wrote down in the early decades of the 1200s is the primary reason we have the kind of systematic access to Norse mythology that we do. The book he wrote is called the Prose Edda. It is not a simple transcription of ancient oral tradition. It is something more complex and more interesting than that. And understanding what it is changes how you understand everything it contains. Snorri was writing in Christian Iceland, in a society that had formally converted to Christianity roughly 200 years before he was born. He was a Christian man writing about a pagan mythology, working from oral traditions and older written sources that were themselves already at a significant distance from whatever the original living practice of Norse religion had been. He was not an archaeologist uncovering intact artifacts. He was a scholar and a poet who could see that the old stories and the old poetic traditions were in danger of being lost, and who set out to preserve and explain them for an audience that might not have the context to understand them. Without guidance, the Prose Edda has three main sections. The first is called Gylfaginning, which translates roughly as the tricking of Gylfi, and it takes the form of a dialogue in which a king visits a mysterious hall and asks questions about the Norse cosmos to three figures who answer him: the creation of the world, the nature of the gods, the events of the mythology, the coming of Ragnarok, and the world that comes after are all presented through this framing device. The second section is called Skaldskaparmal, the language of poetry, and it deals with the complex tradition of Old Norse verse, explaining the metaphorical expressions that Norse poets used and the mythological stories that gave those expressions their meaning. The third section is Hatatal, a demonstration of verse forms. What this means for tonight's story is that the account of Ginnungagap and Ymir, of Odin's eye and the 9 knights on the tree, of Loki and the death of Baldr and the binding of Fenrir and the coming of Ragnarok and the world that surfaces after the fire, came to us substantially through a 13th century Icelandic Christian scholar's attempt to record and in some ways systematize a tradition that was already very old in its oral form when he wrote it down. Snorri was not inventing. Scholars who have worked with these texts carefully make that distinction. He was working from real sources, from oral traditions, and from the older body of poetry that had preserved the mythology in verse for generations. But he was also interpreting, selecting, arranging, and in places filling in connections that the older sources left implicit. The Prose Edda is not a window onto the Viking Age as it was lived. It is a 13th century reconstruction of traditions that had already passed through many hands and many winters before they reached him. The other major source for Norse mythology is the collection known as the Poetic Edda, sometimes called the Elder Edda, to distinguish it from Snorri's work. Though the relationship between the two is not as simple as older and newer, the Poetic Edda is a collection of Old Norse poems that survives primarily in a manuscript called the Codex Regius, written down around 1270, a few decades after Snorri's death. The poems in the collection are older than the manuscript, some of them considerably so, composed across a long span of time before anyone gathered them into a single written form. These poems are the closest we can come to the mythological tradition as it existed in verse, in the form in which it was composed and transmitted before writing arrived in Iceland with Christianity. They include the Voluspa, the prophecy of the Seeress, which gives the most complete surviving account of the Norse cosmological narrative from creation through Ragnarok and into what comes after. They include the Havamal, which contains Odin's own account of his hanging on Yggdrasil. They include the Vafthrudnismal, the source for the detail about Lif and Lifthrasir surviving Ragnarok in Hodmimir's wood. They include poems about Thor and Loki and Freya and many other figures in the tradition, poems that together give the richest surviving picture of the Norse mythological world in its poetic form. But the Codex Regius was written down in Christian Iceland. The poems it contains were selected and arranged by someone, or a succession of someones, whose identities we do not know and whose principles of selection we can only partially reconstruct. Some poems that once existed are lost entirely. Others survive only in fragments or in references within other texts. The tradition we have access to is not the tradition as it existed before conversion and before the centuries of change that preceded the writing down. It is what survived, which is considerable, but which is also incomplete in ways that matter. Scholars who specialize in Old Norse literature speak carefully about what the sources say, what can be inferred from the evidence that remains, and where different texts agree and where they diverge. They note when a detail appears in only one source, and when a story has multiple versions that do not fully align. The mythology as a field of scholarly inquiry is built on careful engagement with incomplete and sometimes contradictory evidence, and that careful engagement is part of what tonight's telling has tried to reflect. There is something worth saying about what it means that the mythology survived at all. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity happened gradually over several centuries, roughly from the late 900s through the 1100s, with Iceland's formal conversion usually dated to around the year 1000. This meant that the old stories, the old gods, the old ways of understanding the cosmos that the mythology described, became officially the pagan past that the new religion had superseded. The conditions that had sustained the living tradition of Norse mythology were gone, and yet the stories survived. They survived in Iceland with a persistence that scholars have found significant. The geographic isolation of Iceland, the strength of the skaldic poetic tradition, which preserved mythological content as part of the technical training in complex verse forms that remained valued even in a Christian context. The culture of the sagas, which created a literary environment where recording and preserving the past was valued, even when the past being preserved was pre-Christian. The specific decisions of people like Snorri, who could see that something was being lost and chose to write it down. Whatever the combination of reasons, the result is that we have the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, and a body of additional material in the sagas and in runestone inscriptions and in the archaeological record. And from this material, the story you have been listening to tonight can be told, not with the completeness of a tradition that was never interrupted, not with the confidence of someone working from a single authoritative text that everyone agreed upon, but with the genuine substance of what survived, which is considerable, and with the respect for what did not survive that comes from understanding how close the whole tradition came to disappearing entirely. Snorri Sturluson was killed in 1240. 1. During the political violence that marked the end of the Icelandic Commonwealth. He was 60. 2 years old, and he died in his own cellar, where he had taken refuge. Killed by men sent by a Norwegian king he had fallen out of favour with. The Prose Edda survived him. The Codex Regius survived the anonymous choices of whoever gathered it. The stories survived the conversion and the centuries and the accidents of which manuscripts were kept and which were lost. They are still here, passed through many hands and many winters, shaped by memory and poetry and time, and the decisions of specific people at specific moments who chose to write something down or to preserve a manuscript rather than let it go, filtered through Snorri's 13th century perspective, preserved in poems composed across centuries before anyone gathered them into a single collection, studied and translated and debated and interpreted by generations of scholars who have brought their own questions to the material. And behind all of that, in the places where the scholarship and the translation point back toward, something older still breathing, something that was told, in one form or another, long before anyone thought to write it down, on ships crossing cold water, in halls lit by fire in the long dark of northern winters, in the voices of people who looked at a sky made from a dead giant's skull and told their children what it contained and what was going to happen to it and what would come after. Those voices are gone. The specific quality of how the stories sounded in their earliest oral form is not recoverable. What we have is the trace, the written record of an oral tradition, the best available account of what the Norse cosmos looked like to the people who built it and lived inside it. It was enough to bring tonight's story to you. Through all the winters between then and now, it is enough to know that the tree stood, that the void became a world, that the world ran its course and the fire came and the earth surfaced again, green, with a sun that nothing was chasing. It is enough to know that someone thought all of this was worth remembering. After the burning, after the ocean, after the field where everyone who walked onto it knew they would not walk off it, after the new earth surfaced, green from the water, and the young gods sat in the new grass, and found the old game pieces, and the sun moved across a new sky with nothing behind it. The story reaches the place where stories of this kind reach when they have been told in full, not an ending, a pause between breaths. Yggdrasil still stands. The sources handle the exact fate of the tree in the fire of Surt with the same openness they bring to many of the things that exist at the edges of what the mythology can fully describe. What is clear is that the cosmos the tree had sustained was consumed in the fire. What happened to the tree itself, the sources do not all say the same way. And scholars who work with this material note that the accounts do not perfectly align. And yet in the account of the new world that the surviving texts give us, in the images of the green earth and the returning gods and the fields that bear crops without being planted, there is the presence of something at the centre of the new cosmos that connects what is above to what is below, that does what the tree has always done. Whether it is the same tree or something new that grew from the ash matters less than what both possibilities mean. If it is the same tree, then the gnawing from below and the weight of all the ages and the fire that came from the south were not. In the end, enough. The tree that was always dying was also always living, and the living persisted to the other side of the fire. Because that is what living things sometimes do, when what is trying to consume them meets something in the living thing that has not yet finished. If it is something new, then what grew in the ash of the old tree is evidence that the capacity to produce worlds was not located in any particular arrangement that the fire could destroy. It was located in something more fundamental, something that fire could burn the expression of but not the source of, something that grows again from ash because growing is what it is. The tree stands, in one form or another, in the new world. Nidhogg is still there too. The Voluspa mentions it. After describing the new earth and the returning gods and the crops that no one planted, Nidhogg is mentioned, flying up from below, still present in the new world alongside everything that makes the new world feel like a beginning. This can be read as a dark sign, as evidence that the cycle will begin again, that the new world will eventually find itself in the same position as the old one. It can also be read as something else, as the acknowledgement that the new world is not a sanitized version of what came before. The serpent is still there because the new world is still a real world. A world with something in it that does not rest and does not wish the foundations well. A world with pressure in it, with the particular kind of pressure that has always been the condition under which living things show what they are. A paradise would not have Nidhogg, a real world does, and the tree is still standing. Both of those things are true at the same time. The serpent is there, and the tree is there, and the serpent is doing what the serpent has always done, and the tree is doing what the tree has always done. The contest between them has not been resolved. It has been continued. In the new world, with the new world's conditions, the tree holds, not because the serpent stopped, not because the tending repaired all the damage, not because the fire did not come or the wolf did not catch what it had been chasing since the first morning of the world. The serpent is simply still doing what it does, and the tree is still standing, because standing is what the tree is. Think about what it means to be something that does not know how not to stand, not something that stands because it has decided to, not something that stands because it has made a commitment to standing or been instructed that standing is required. Something that stands because standing is what it is, because the alternative is not something it contains within its nature. The gnawing from below and the weight of everything the branches carry and the fire that has already come and gone once have all done what they could do. The tree is still there. This is the image at the centre of Norse mythology. When you follow it all the way through tonight's story, from the void before everything to the green earth after the fire, not a god who wins, not a cosmos that resolves its tensions into permanent harmony, not a universe that rewards those who deserve to be rewarded, a tree that stands in full knowledge of what is eating it, through everything that has happened and is happening and will happen, not because the problem at its roots has been solved, but because standing is what it does. Odin knew what was coming and he sent the ravens out every morning. The Norns poured water over roots they knew would face the fire. Sigyn held the bowl. The tree stood, one answer preserved in these stories. Across all the different forms they took and all the different hands they passed through, is consistent. You carry yourself like the tree. You stand in full knowledge of what is eating you, and you stand anyway, not because standing will save you, not because the fire will not come, but because standing is what there is to do, because the tending matters even when the tree is going to burn, because the ravens come back. Most mornings, the light over Asgard was different after Baldr died, smaller and colder and more definitely moving toward its end, and the light was still there. The tree still stood. It is standing now, in the new world, in the new green grass, with something below its roots that has not stopped, and something above its branches that is quieter than it has ever been, and two human beings somewhere in Hodmimir's wood, beginning from what survived the fire. The game pieces are in the grass. Someone will pick them up. Let the room settle around you now. Let the weight of tonight's journey go. You have moved through all of it. From the void before everything to the green earth after the fire. From the first silence that was violent to the new light moving without anything chasing it. The fan hums softly if you have it running. The dark outside your window is the ordinary dark. The kind that will be followed by an ordinary morning. By an ordinary sun moving across an ordinary sky. Nothing is chasing it. The tree still stands. Rest now.